Now beginning. Story 1, The Grid Beneath the Empire, the Roman Street Plan. At first glance, Roman urban planning appears deceptively simple. The concept of right angles, intersecting streets, and consistent layouts is not difficult to grasp, but beneath these straight lines lies a deep and deliberate philosophy of control, order, and identity, a worldview etched into stone, soil, and sand from Britannia to Syria. The Roman street plan, especially the foundational Cardo and Decumanus, was more than urban convenience. It was ideology. It was Rome. The seeds of structure. The story of Rome's street planning begins not in Rome, but in the agrimensors, land surveyors who were more than simple measurers of fields. Rooted in Etruscan and early Italic traditions, these professionals carried sacred and legal responsibilities. The groma, a simple yet effective surveying instrument consisting of a vertical staff with cross arms and plumb lines, became the tool of Roman order. The process of founding a city, especially a colonia, was ritualized. The augur, a priest interpreting omens, would define the auspicious point. From that sacred axis, lines were drawn, the Cardo Maximus running north-south, the Decumanus Maximus running east-west. All else radiated from that intersection. This wasn't arbitrary. To the Romans, aligning a city to the heavens ensured divine favor and aligned the people within it to the emperor, the army, and the state. But what made this significant wasn't the geometry. It was the replication. Whether a soldier walked the streets of Timgad in North Africa or Cologne in Germania, the logic of space was the same. The street plan told him, this too is Rome. Colonial cloning. The vastness of the Roman Empire demanded more than conquest, it required cultural and spatial homogenization. As new lands were absorbed, Rome imposed its logic through urban planning. Cities were established for veterans, for trade, or as administrative hubs. Their layouts mirrored each other like clones. A forum at the heart, barracks near the edge, markets in designated blocks, and main roads leading directly to gates. This uniformity was not an afterthought. It was a mechanism of imperial identity. A Roman walking into a newly founded colony recognized the orientation of streets, the location of the basilica, and the sequence of urban experience. Every street plan whispered of home, even on foreign soil. Some towns, like Timgad in modern Algeria, have retained this structure in near-perfect form. Founded under Emperor Trajan in 100 CE, Timgad was built from scratch as a veteran colony. Its design is textbook Roman, a square grid of insulae blocks, flanked by colonnaded streets, centered on a bustling forum. Though now abandoned, its plan remains eerily readable, like an open-air blueprint of Roman intent. Streets for walking, not wandering. Roman streets had a purpose beyond transit. They structured the flow of goods, law, and people. The Decumanus Maximus often carried the weight of commerce, hosting shops, stables, and taverns. The Cardo, in turn, might host religious processions or administrative buildings. Narrower vicali, alleys, threaded through residential districts, forming a hierarchy of movement much like arteries and veins. Yet Roman planners were not slaves to idealism. The natural topography of a site could bend the lines slightly. Hills, rivers, or older settlements necessitated adjustments. Pompeii, though eventually Romanized, retained much of its earlier Samnite street irregularities. Even in Rome itself, the ideal grid was broken evidence that practice often made uneasy compromises with tradition and terrain. Of curbs and crossings. Roman streets were more than flat surfaces. They had a profile cambered to allow water drainage, flanked by raised sidewalks, and punctuated by stepping stones for crossing without wetting one's sandals. These design features, humble and practical, reflect a civilization deeply concerned with daily functionality. Wheel ruts still visible in ancient stone today hint at the repetitiveness of Roman traffic and how predictable the patterns of urban movement became. In some cities, the width of the streets was standardized to accommodate carts in one or two directions. In others, tight alleys prohibited cart entry altogether. Regulations, though rarely thrilling to study, existed limiting daytime cart traffic in central Rome, for instance, to reduce congestion. The quiet power of the grid. The street grid wasn't just for movement. It defined property, shaped behavior, and guided development. Roman cadastral surveys, meticulously recorded on bronze tablets or stone inscriptions, mapped land parcels in astonishing detail. These records part geography, part bureaucracy enabled taxation, inheritance, and governance. By breaking land into uniform rectangles, Roman authorities could assign and reassign plots with administrative ease. Newcomers were slotted into pre-drawn blocks. Markets emerged where two busy roads met. Bathhouses were placed at convenient intervals. This predictability, boring though it may seem, allowed cities to grow without descending into chaos. Consider this. Many modern cities, from Barcelona to Philadelphia, owe part of their grid layout to Roman principles. The idea that order on paper could translate into order on the ground was not born in the 19th century, it was carved into marble 2,000 years ago. The edge of the grid. But even Roman control had its limits. As cities expanded, informal settlements grew beyond the walls, especially around gates or along roads. These areas, often populated by the poor, the mobile, or the marginalized, lacked the rigid street plans of the core. Here, winding alleys and irregular lots returned. Rome could impose structure, but it could not always contain the spontaneity of life. And so, the grid precise and ideal stood at the center of Roman planning, but was always surrounded by the blur of reality. A reminder that even the most meticulous designs must contend with the unpredictability of human needs. And so we begin our walk through the empire not by emperors or armies, but by the lines they drew beneath their feet. What happens when these grids meet the rising tide of life, chaos, and decay? If Section 1 introduced the Roman grid as a structural and symbolic framework, Section 2 dives deeper into the lived experiences within that grid. Streets were not just about lines on a map. They were noisy, grimy, busy spaces where law, commerce, religion, and daily survival all collided. From the forum to the alley, the street was both infrastructure and stage shaping, channeling, and sometimes resisting the will of planners. The forum, where all roads led, installed. Every Roman city had its forum, typically at the intersection of the Cardo and Decumanus. It served as the administrative, legal, and economic center of the city, functioning more like a living room than a traffic hub. The space itself was pedestrianized, flanked by the basilica, curia, temples, and rows of shops under porticos. And yet, for all its order, it was not a quiet place. Street performers, legal orators, money changers, and gossiping elites all made the forum a theater of civic life. The planners may have drawn straight lines, but the people filled them with contradictions. Senators might debate law just meters from barbers giving shaves or slaves selling hot bread. It was urban choreography built on constant noise, scent, and movement. Yet the presence of the forum at the grid's heart was no accident. It centralized control. It allowed the governor, magistrates, or military officials to remain at the symbolic and literal center of civic life. Of stones, wheels, and sandals. Moving outward, the Roman street reveals its deeply textured surface. The average Roman road was made not of smooth paving, but of polygonal basalt blocks, carefully laid to form a relatively flat but durable surface. Between the stones were gaps that allowed drainage but also trapped dirt, debris, and often excrement. The raised sidewalks allowed pedestrians to walk without stepping into the filth, though water or waste often sloshed up anyway. The wear patterns on surviving Roman roads tell us much. Deep wheel ruts, sometimes several inches deep, show how standardized vehicle sizes became across the empire. In fact, it's believed that the standard width of a Roman chariot, about 4.5 feet, would influence future road widths in Europe for centuries. There was no concept of zoning laws as we understand them, but the street hierarchy enforced an informal rhythm. Main avenues saw carts and commercial traffic. Side alleys handled foot traffic and local chatter. Street corners became natural meeting points, and many even hosted shrines to Larry's Compitille's household gods of the neighborhood crossroads. A smell of the past, waste, water, and cleanliness. Despite Rome's famous aqueducts, street-level sanitation remained a mixed affair. Water was available from public fountains, spaced strategically throughout a city and supplied by lead or terracotta pipes. But there were no indoor plumbing systems for most citizens, especially in the packed insulae, apartment buildings. Chamber pots were emptied into the street, where the water from fountains or rain was expected to wash it away. In theory, streets were cleaned by slaves hired by the aedile, a public official, but in practice, cleaning was sporadic at best. Residents might sweep the section outside their home or shop, but many relied on the simple strategy of dumping trash into the gutter and hopping it moved on. Washing oneself was more ceremonial than street-based. Public baths handled personal hygiene, while clothes were laundered at pholoniki, which used ammonia derived from urine to clean garments. Interestingly, fullers would often collect urine from public urinals on the street, a strange intersection of infrastructure and industry. The streets carried smells strong, pungent, layered. You might walk past a bakery, then pass a leatherworker boiling hides, then step over a trickle of wastewater seeping from an alley. And always the lingering presence of people, animals, food, and time. Street-level commerce, the tabernae and popini. While Rome is often romanticized through its grand monuments, the true economic heart of any Roman city beat at street level. The grid enabled the efficient placement of tabernae one-room shops that opened directly onto the street. They were often embedded in the front walls of homes or larger buildings and rented out to butchers, cobblers, barbers, scribes, or traders. A street lined with tabernae resembled a kind of ancient strip mall. Merchants called out prices. Slaves ran errands. Animals moved slowly between wagons. Children played in doorways while workers haggled. It was commerce in constant motion. There were also popini, informal eateries that served hot food and cheap wine to working-class residents. These often clustered near busy intersections, where foot traffic was guaranteed. They were lively and often rowdy places. Unlike Roman elites who dined in private villas, the average Roman might take meals on the go, or perch on a stool by a popina counter and eat boiled lentils, salted fish, or warm bread with oil. Messages in stone and paint, graffiti and signage. The Roman street was not just physically active, it was textually alive. Walls were rarely blank. Citizens scrawled graffiti, announcements, political slogans, love notes, and crude jokes directly onto plaster walls. In places like Pompeii, thousands of such writings have been preserved. These unfiltered voices reveal a world of real people insulting rivals, advertising gladiators, or praising lovers. A painted notice might read, 20 pairs of gladiators of Aulus Sutius Certus will fight at Nola. No death will go unavenged. Come and enjoy. Another might simply state, Secundus loves Iris, may she return the favor. The grid may have ordered space, but the walls belong to the people. Murals, election notices, and graffiti layered the street in memory and noise. Even without being physically present, people left marks that reshaped how others moved through their city. Street as theater, rituals, parades, and processions. The streets were also ritual landscapes. Religious processions, particularly in cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Ephesus, used streets to organize festivals, celebrate deities, or assert civic power. The planning ensured that temples and altars aligned with key streets, turning movement into ceremony. Perhaps the most significant was the Triumph, a public celebration granted to victorious generals. Starting at the Campus Martius, the parade would snake through Rome's streets, past cheering citizens, toward the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Chariots, captives, loot, and soldiers created a temporary transformation of the city's space into a stage of empire. The grid was flexible. In daily life, it was practical. But in moments like these, it became a canvas for political spectacle. Shadows and danger, nightfall in the grid. While the Roman street was busy by day, it shifted dramatically after dark. Oil lamps, expensive and often dim, provided minimal lighting. Public lighting was rare, and most citizens retreated indoors after sunset. Streets became the domain of criminals, vagrants, or the occasional night patrol. The vigils, a hybrid fire brigade and police force, patrolled the streets, but their numbers were limited. In poorer neighborhoods, alleyways could become dangerous after dark. Mugging, assault, and even murder were not uncommon. Wealthier citizens often hired private guards or litter bearers to escort them home from dinner parties. To deter intruders, some shops had iron grills and heavy wooden doors. Residents might throw scraps to dogs that roamed the streets. Urban night was a space of ambiguity, partially visible, partially known, barely controlled. Order meets chaos, where the grid ends. Eventually, Roman cities grew beyond the plans. Informal settlements arose at the periphery, usually beyond the city walls. These areas, sometimes called suburbia, were home to the poor, freedmen, traveling merchants, and immigrants. Unlike the orderly central grid, these neighborhoods had irregular lanes, unauthorized buildings, and limited access to services. And yet life persisted here. People adapted. Small shrines, pop-up markets, and communal wells gave structure. Over time, the very disorder of these zones created their own logic. This wasn't failure, it was evolution. The Roman grid, like any human system, was eventually reshaped by the people it tried to control. As we follow the ancient grid from center to edge, a question arises. Can a city remain Roman when its people live in ways the planners never imagined? By now, we have traced the Roman grid from its precise, cosmologically aligned inception to its bustling, sometimes chaotic daily life. But the final part of this story lies not in how Roman streets were designed or used, but in what happened after the planners stopped drawing lines and the people left them behind. How does a civilization's infrastructure survive its civilization? And what becomes of a street when the empire that built it no longer marches across it? The cracks in the pattern decline from the inside. Rome's grand urban plans were not immune to time. As the empire aged, so too did its streets. The 3rd and 4th centuries CE saw mounting pressure, economic crisis, military instability, and plagues that thinned urban populations. In many cities, buildings fell into disrepair. Some insulae collapsed entirely, while once busy tabernae were shuttered. Maintenance of streets once overseen by aediles, funded by civic pride or imperial grants, became sporadic. As commerce slowed, streets hardened into silence. Vendors disappeared, processions thinned, inscriptions faded, and graffiti stopped being replaced. Even in Rome itself, parts of the city began to feel abandoned. The contrast was sharp, a grid still standing but barely inhabited. At the edges of the empire, things deteriorated faster. In cities like Londinium, London, or Lugdunum, Lyon, once vital streets became overgrown. Road surfaces cracked, sidewalks crumbled, and grass grew between basalt stones once pounded by carts. This wasn't a collapse in the dramatic sense. It was more like a fatting, quiet, incremental, and mostly unrecorded. When the grid becomes a quarry. As imperial funding dried up and urban populations shrank, the remains of the Roman city became a resource. Stones from roads, columns, and abandoned temples were pulled up and repurposed, used to repair city walls, build Christian churches, or patch aqueducts. The very streets that had once imposed imperial order became quarries for survival. Sometimes, the grid was so thoroughly stripped that later generations forgot it ever existed. A future farmer or monk might till a field or build a barn over what was once the Decumanus Maximus, unaware of the engineered surface just below. But in other cases, the ghost of the Roman street plan lingered. Medieval cities, particularly in southern Europe, often grew within the old Roman walls, inheriting the layout. Streets narrowed, buildings changed shape, but the orientation remained. Some roads in modern cities still follow paths laid out over 2 millennia ago. Christianity and the new urban focus. As the empire Christianized, so too did the meaning of space. The old Roman forum, once the heart of civic life, fell into disuse. Temples were abandoned or converted into churches. New centers of gravity emerged: bishoprics, baptistries, and monasteries, often built on or near old civic buildings, but repurposed to a new cosmic order. Street plans were no longer laid out by augurs seeking omens, but by bishops and abbots. While some early Christian leaders viewed Roman urbanism as a relic of pagan excess, others pragmatically reused what remained. Yet the central symmetry of Roman planning, its belief in rational, geometric order, no longer drove development. Streets bent, twisted, narrowed. Informality took over. Cities became less predictable. Still, some Roman-era roads retained their practical use. In many towns, the Cardo Maximus became the main market street in the medieval period, just with new signs, new languages, and new gods. Ruralization and the retreat from the grid. One of the most striking transformations in the centuries after Rome's fall was the deurbanization of Europe. As political structures collapsed, populations increasingly moved to rural estates for protection, stability, or access to food. Cities shrank, both in size and importance. Some Roman towns became villages, others were abandoned entirely. The Roman street grid, once replicated across continents, lost its ideological force. New settlements grew around fortresses, monasteries, or natural features. They rarely followed orthogonal layouts. Instead, they reflected the terrain, local needs, and improvisation. But in this shift, we find an echo of something older. Before Rome imposed the grid, cities across the ancient world had been organic, irregular, even chaotic. The Roman experiment had brought uniformity to urban space, but human settlement ultimately returned to its messier roots. The long shadow, Rome in the Renaissance. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, something unexpected happened. Scholars, artists, and architects rediscovering Roman texts and ruins began to see the beauty and logic of the Roman grid anew. In cities like Florence and Rome, new buildings were erected with an eye towards symmetry, proportion, and perspective. The Vitruvian ideals of urban planning, rooted in Roman philosophy, returned to influence design. Even beyond Italy, urban planners in the 17th and 18th centuries began to imitate Roman principles. Cities in the Americas, such as Philadelphia, were laid out with straight streets, axial symmetry, and central plazas, deliberately recalling the Roman model. The Roman grid had become, once more, a symbol of civilization, not through conquest this time, but through architecture and ideals. Archaeology and the rediscovery of the grid. Today, many of the best preserved Roman street grids have reemerged thanks to archaeology. Cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by volcanic ash, offer near-complete snapshots of Roman street life. Timgad in North Africa lies open to the sky, its blocks and colonnades still sharply defined. In Britain, Germany, and France, excavations often reveal the outlines of former decumani, now hidden beneath modern pavements or parking lots. In places like Barcelona, the Roman street grid lies directly beneath the medieval and modern city, detectable by patterns in property lines or the orientation of buildings. Technology has helped too. LiDAR scanning, used from aircraft, has revealed buried Roman cities in dense forest or farmland, invisible to the naked eye but legible as grids beneath the surface. And so the Roman street lives on, not just underfoot, but in memory maps, and models. Legacy in asphalt and cement. Modern urban design still bears Roman fingerprints. The emphasis on zoning, right-angled street intersections, and grid-based development stems from Roman precedent. The idea that a city should be planned, not just grown, owes much to how Rome approached colonization. The problems, too, echo. Issues like congestion, waste management, overcrowding, and urban sprawl plagued Roman planners, just as they do today. Their solutions, wide avenues, public sanitation systems, neighborhood divisions, remain remarkably relevant. Yet perhaps the most striking legacy is psychological. The Roman grid told its citizens, in stone and silence, "You are part of something larger. You belong to Rome." In a world fractured by distances, dialects, and dangers, the familiar geometry of a Roman city gave a sense of continuity. Even today, standing in the middle of a long-abandoned decumanus, flanked by colonnades long collapsed, one can feel a trace of that order, a faint whisper from a civilization that refused chaos. The city as memory. In the end, the Roman street grid was not just a plan. It was an argument, a worldview cast in geometry, a claim that cities could be rational, organized, and eternal, mirroring the empire itself. But like all arguments, it was subject to challenge. People bent the lines, built beyond the walls, ignored the centrality of the forum. They scrawled graffiti on marble columns and dumped trash in gutters. They brought the grid to life, and then slowly let it fade. Still, beneath many modern cities, the Roman layout endures. It is not always visible. Sometimes it's hidden in the curve of a street, the name of a plaza, or the foundation of a building. But it is there. A silent reminder that, once, someone stood here with a groma in hand, drew two lines in the dirt, and imagined an empire taking shape around them. In the quiet decay of abandoned roads, in the recycled stones of medieval churches, in the skeleton of modern city plans, we still walk, unknowingly, on the grid of Rome. But does the grid shape the people, or do the people inevitably reshape the grid? Story 2. Sewers of Civilization, the Cloaca Maxima and Sanitation. The glory of ancient Rome is often told in marble monuments, aqueducts, and the military roadways that spread civilization outward from the capital. But few monuments are as critical or as overlooked as the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's greatest sewer. This subterranean channel, still functioning in part today, reflects not only Roman engineering but a quiet obsession with order, cleanliness, and control. If the street grid was the skeleton of the city, then the sewer was its intestine, hidden, functional, and vital. To understand it is to understand Rome not through battle or spectacle, but through filth. And how a society deals with filth says a great deal about how it understands itself. The foundations, before Rome, before bricks. Long before the empire rose, the land where Rome would be built was a marshy basin between hills, crisscrossed with streams. These lowlands flooded frequently, turning early settlements into a mosaic of mud, stagnant water, and breeding grounds for disease. According to Roman legend, the Cloaca Maxima was first constructed in the 6th century BCE, during the reign of King Tarquinius Priscus, one of Rome's Etruscan kings. It was built not only to carry waste, but more crucially, to drain the swamps that pooled in what would later become the Roman Forum. Originally an open canal, the cloaca began as an act of land reclamation. In many ways, it was Rome's first great act of urban planning, not a monument to be admired, but an attempt to tame nature itself. The Romans understood that before civilization could rise, the earth had to be made dry. By the time of the Republic, the canal had been enclosed, forming a covered sewer. Over centuries, it would be expanded, repaired, and integrated into the expanding city, becoming a vast underground network that spanned neighborhoods and centuries. Engineering without glory. The Cloaca Maxima wasn't a glamorous project. Unlike temples or aqueducts, it didn't feature inscriptions honoring emperors. It didn't inspire poetry or celebration, and yet it required a staggering level of coordination, labor, and foresight. Early construction used large stone blocks, fitted together without mortar, following Etruscan traditions of Cyclopean masonry. Over time, concrete and brick-faced vaults replaced stone sections, creating durable tunnels capable of handling not only human waste, but rainwater, runoff, and debris. What's remarkable is the longevity of these materials. Many parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still intact. In some places, modern archaeologists have discovered Roman bricks still bearing the stamps of legions who produced them, like silent signatures on this anonymous infrastructure. The system expands. As Rome grew, so did its sewage system. The Cloaca Maxima became the main trunk, absorbing smaller drains and tributaries from the city's neighborhoods. These local channels often began as gutters in the street, collecting runoff, refuse, and waste that flowed into covered drains along the sidewalk edges. Eventually, this dirty mix found its way into the Cloaca Maxima, and from there, into the Tiber River. This convergence of private and public waste was not always well regulated. While wealthier homes might connect their latrines directly to the sewer system, many buildings simply dumped chamber pot contents into the street, trusting gravity and rain to wash it away. In this way, the Cloaca Maxima was less a modern sewage system and more a flood channel designed to move water and waste away from populated areas, not to treat or neutralize it. The Romans had no concept of microbial infection or waterborne pathogens, but they understood smell, decay, and nuisance. The sewer helped control those. Life above the flow. To walk through Rome in the 1st century CE was to walk above an invisible stream. While streets might appear bustling and grand, lined with colonnades and shops, the reality beneath was far less sanitary. Animals left droppings. Vendors discarded spoiled goods. Rain turned dust to mud and waste into sludge. The sewer system couldn't keep up with everything, especially in dense areas like the Subura, a crowded, working-class district near the Forum. And yet the cloaca was essential. It prevented flooding. It allowed for the siting of baths, forums, and temples in what had once been marshland. Without it, the Forum Romanum, center of Roman political life, would likely have remained a seasonal swamp. There are even suggestions, based on archaeological finds, that Rome's gladiatorial games made use of the sewers beneath the Colosseum for drainage, and perhaps more elaborate purposes, like releasing wild animals through trap doors, fed from underground tunnels. Not just filth, a sacred channel. Strangely, despite its function, the Cloaca Maxima held a semi-sacred status in Roman thought. Romans viewed water clean or dirty as linked to divine forces. The goddess Closina, whose name literally means the purifier, was associated with the sewer system. She had a shrine near the Forum where the sewer began. This wasn't irony. It reflected a belief that purging filth was itself a sacred act, part of the cosmic balance. This tension between the dirty and the divine is deeply Roman. The same culture that held elaborate purification rituals also celebrated a sewer. Not openly, not glamorously, but with enough respect to offer small altars, inscriptions, and dedications. Maintenance and the invisible workforce. Keeping the sewer functional required labor quiet, dangerous, and uncelebrated. Slaves, publicani, private contractors, and municipal workers performed the necessary dredging, clearing, and inspections. Clogged tunnels posed a risk not just to sanitation, but to flooding during heavy rain. Blockages could back up through street drains or cause collapse. The work was unpleasant. Workers faced toxic gases, sudden water surges, rats, and disease. There are few records of their names, but their fingerprints remain in hastily scratched graffiti, in tool marks, in patches of repair stonework hidden in the tunnels. Occasionally, city officials, especially aediles or censors, might oversee maintenance projects. But much of the day-to-day grime fell to nameless laborers, maintaining the bones and bowels of the empire while history looked the other way. The cloaca and the Tiber, a perpetual exchange. Ultimately, the Cloaca Maxima emptied into the Tiber River, Rome's natural drainage point and aquatic highway. This created a cyclical pollution problem. The same river that received waste also served as a source of water for washing, irrigation, and upstream drinking. The Romans were aware of the need to source water from clean tributaries or aqueducts, but downstream use of the Tiber remained common. The river thus became a conduit of exchange, carrying away what the city no longer needed, while bringing in food, goods, and people. But what happened during floods? The Tiber often overflowed, especially in the spring. When that occurred, the river reversed course and sewage backed up into the city. Streets became open cesspools. Homes near the river suffered. The Cloaca Maxima, so vital in dry times, became a curse in the wet. The Romans tried to counter this with levees, embankments, and tunnels, but complete control was impossible. Water, like history, has a way of reclaiming the spaces people try to tame. A legacy buried but not forgotten. The Cloaca Maxima remained in use well into the medieval period. Pilgrims, merchants, and even popes walked over it, unaware or uninterested in the ancient engineering below. Later in the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the old sewer. They marveled at its endurance. Enlightenment thinkers saw in it a model of functional architecture. Victorian engineers in London and Paris, designing modern sewer systems, studied the cloaca as a historical precedent. In the 19th century, portions were cleared and explored. Tourists descended into the ancient tunnels, guided by candlelight, staring at the same stones that had moved the detritus of Caesar's Rome. Today, small sections remain visible to visitors, though most of the sewer is now closed off. Yet even now, the idea of a city without sewage feels absurd. We rarely praise sewers, but we cannot live without them. Here, in the dark, buried corridors beneath temples and palaces, the real work of civilization continued. What does it mean that the most enduring monument of Rome may not be one of glory but of garbage? In the previous section, we explored the architectural birth and spiritual ambiguity of the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, and its crucial role in transforming a swampy basin into a functional urban capital. Now, we descend further, not into the sewer itself, but into the daily routines, habits, and hidden labor that filled it. Rome, for all its grandeur, was a city of dense housing, limited plumbing, and constant waste. The Romans lived in close quarters with their own filth, and the sewer system, though sophisticated, was not a cure-all. It was a bandage, applied daily to a city always on the verge of overflow. To understand the Cloaca Maxima is to understand what it meant to live in ancient Rome, not in palaces or temples, but in rented rooms, with chamber pots, crowded streets, and no privacy. Inside the insula, high-rise living without plumbing. Rome was a vertical city. Its population, estimated between 800,000 and over 1 million in the 1st century CE, lived primarily in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings made of brick, wood, and concrete. These were not luxurious. Most were cheaply constructed and densely packed. A single building might house dozens of families. And most insulae had no running water. Tenants on the upper floors carried water up by hand or paid for delivery. Latrines, when present, were usually communal and located on the ground floor or in nearby courtyards. Above the 1st or 2nd floors, tenants typically used chamber pots. These were emptied sometimes down stairwells, often out windows. Regulations forbade throwing waste from windows without warning, but enforcement was lax. The phrase caveat stercus, watch out for dung, was more practical than legal. These daily practices meant that waste management was both deeply personal and disturbingly public. The streets below often bore the brunt. Streets as sewer, Drainage, disposal, and disgust. Roman streets, especially in lower neighborhoods, were sloped and cambered to channel water and waste into side gutters. During heavy rains or after aqueduct-supplied fountains overflowed, a dirty stream would flow down the road toward the cloaca's open inlets. This system functioned best in dry, predictable weather, but in times of rain, blockage, or crowding, waste backed up. Debris clogged drains. Gutters became mini channels of filth, often a mixture of animal dung, food waste, ash, and human excrement. And not all neighborhoods were connected equally. Wealthier districts had better infrastructure, while poorer areas, especially on the Aventine or in the Subura, relied on improvised drainage or none at all. In some cases, cesspits were dug and emptied manually. The result was a city that smelled. Ancient authors, from Seneca to Martial, commented on the stench. The poet Juvenal wrote of streets slick with filth and citizens who held their breath while walking. Who took out the trash? The process of sanitation in Rome was largely decentralized. While the state maintained main sewers and fountains, daily cleanup fell to individuals and contractors. There was no public garbage service in the modern sense. Instead, shops, vendors, and households employed slaves, porters, or free laborers to carry out trash, sometimes to designated dumps, more often to public streets or abandoned lots. Organic waste might be burned or left to rot. Ash and broken pottery filled potholes. Bones were fed to dogs or thrown into canals. Graffiti even reveals complaints about neighbors piling garbage near doors or temples. In wealthier households, a slave called the purgator might manage latrines and chamber pots. But for the majority, waste disposal was a personal burden, dirty, constant, and never fully solved. The latrine experience, public and private relief. Public latrines were one of the more remarkable Roman innovations and also one of its least dignified. These communal toilets, often attached to bathhouses or forums, featured stone benches with keyhole openings, situated over flowing water. Users sat side by side, without dividers, chatting or reading as they relieved themselves. Beneath the benches, drains washed waste into larger sewers, usually connected to the Cloaca Maxima or its tributaries. But hygiene was questionable. The infamous tersarium, a sponge on a stick used for wiping, was shared communally. It was rinsed in a water channel that ran in front of the latrines, but this did little to prevent disease. Still, the public latrine was a practical marvel. It demonstrated Roman ingenuity using water pressure, slope, and access points to create a relatively sustainable system. Some even featured mosaic floors, marble benches, and inscriptions, revealing that public sanitation could be both functional and aesthetic. Yet, like much in Rome, these services were unevenly distributed. Poor districts lacked latrines. Travelers or laborers used streets, alleys, or field edges, and women who had fewer public spaces often resorted to chamber pots or makeshift relief behind market stalls. Baths and cleanliness, not just for show. Despite the filth of the streets, Romans were obsessed with bathing. Public baths were more than places to get clean, they were centers of social life, relaxation, and even business. But they also played a critical role in public hygiene. Bathhouses helped cleanse bodies that might have otherwise carried disease from poor sanitation. They also produced waste. Heated water, sweat, oil, and debris had to be drained somewhere. Many bathhouses connected directly to the sewer system, often with complex drainage systems that separated wastewater from the primary water flow. This integration of personal and civic cleanliness was not perfect, but it showed a Roman willingness to connect infrastructure to routine, embedding engineering into the everyday. Water clean in, dirty out. Rome's famous aqueducts brought clean water from distant springs into the city, feeding fountains, bathhouses, private villas, and industries. But just as critical as delivery was drainage. Roman engineers understood the need for outflow. For every gallon that entered the city, an equal or greater amount left it used, soiled, and contaminated. This is where the cloaca maxima proved indispensable. It functioned as the end point for a water cycle that began in distant hills. And while it did not purify the water, it removed it quickly, keeping the city relatively dry. Without this outflow, Rome's hydraulic network would have failed. The aqueducts might have kept flowing, but the streets would have become swamps. Danger below, sewers as entry and exit points. The Roman sewer system was not just a place for waste. Occasionally, it served as a secret path for criminals, for escapees, or even for daring assassins. Ancient sources suggest that during periods of political unrest, rebels or spies used the sewers to evade capture. In one account, a supporter of the murdered Julius Caesar escaped Rome through a tunnel connected to a private latrine. There are also hints that the sewers were used to dispose of corpses, particularly in times of plague or social chaos. The lack of sanitation infrastructure in some neighborhoods led to desperate, grim decisions. That said, crawling into a sewer was a risky proposition. Gases, collapses, and sudden floods made it a dangerous route. But its very existence, hidden, constant, underestimated, meant it always remained part of the city's story, even at its margins. Echoes in the empire. Rome was not alone in building sewers, but few cities matched its scale and continuity. Other Roman colonies built sewer systems based on the same principles. In Pompeii, archaeologists found small sewers beneath main roads. In Ostia, the port city, channels directed runoff from warehouses and fishmongers. In Ephesus, Trier, and Timgad, variants of the cloaca maxima kept cities dry and functional. But only Rome maintained such a system for centuries, and only Rome managed to extend that infrastructure beyond the reign of individual emperors. The sewer was not the achievement of one man. It was the work of generations, of continuity, of maintenance. In this way, the cloaca maxima reflected the Roman ideal, order through permanence. In the grime of chamber pots, in the flow beneath marble streets, in the silent labor of the purgator, Rome kept itself clean enough to endure. But how clean was clean, and how long could order hold back the flood? By now, we've examined the cloaca maxima from foundation to function, from its mythic beginnings to its role in the daily lives of Roman citizens. In this final section, we turn to its decline, its quiet endurance, and the legacy it left for a world that slowly forgot what it owed to the engineered management of waste. The sewer, like the empire above it, would not last forever, but unlike emperors, it never sought monuments. Its survival would be its only tribute. Even now, centuries after Rome fell, a portion of the cloaca maxima still runs, carrying the past downstream. The long flush, decline and afterlife of the cloaca. As the Roman Empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, its cities experienced increasing infrastructural stress. The aqueducts vital for feeding the sewer system fell into disrepair, or were deliberately cut by invading forces. Without fresh water pouring into fountains, baths, and latrines, the flow of wastewater slowed. The sewers began to clog. In some districts, they silted up entirely. Maintenance halted. City funds were redirected toward defense, not drainage. In 410 CE, the Visigoths sacked Rome, and in 455 CE, the Vandals followed. These events symbolized the fall of Rome, but for the cloaca maxima, they marked the beginning of a slow burial. Earth shifted, roofs collapsed, floods filled tunnels with silt. And yet it never fully ceased. In places, the sewer adapted. It carried runoff. It absorbed street waste. Rainwater continued to carve its ancient channels. Some medieval churches even drained their crypts into the cloaca, using it as an unseen but reliable partner. Medieval Rome, a city above ruins. By the 8th century, Rome had become a shadow of itself. Its population had dropped to as low as 20,000, clustering near the Tiber. Much of the monumental core forums, theaters, baths was abandoned or scavenged for stone. Yet the sewer persisted. Medieval Romans walked streets laid atop collapsed Roman ones. In many cases, houses were built from Roman ruins, with stairwells descending into ancient substructures including parts of the Cloaca Maxima. Knowledge of the sewer's exact course faded, but its presence endured in myth and rumor. Travelers spoke of tunnels large enough to walk through, of rivers beneath Rome, and of forgotten entrances swallowed by time. Cloaca Maxima became a liminal space part infrastructure, part folklore. In some accounts, criminals used it to hide, and monks claimed it as symbolic of man's descent into sin. The sewer had become metaphor as much as machine. Renaissance rediscovery and romantic curiosity. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as Renaissance scholars and artists rediscovered classical texts and ruins, the Cloaca Maxima returned to public awareness. Humanists admired it as a symbol of Roman ingenuity. Leon Battista Alberti, one of the earliest architectural theorists of the Renaissance, cited it as evidence of Roman greatness not because it was beautiful, but because it was functional and lasting. Maps of ancient Rome began to include sewer lines. Artists drew cross-sections of imagined tunnels. In 1555, Pope Paul IV ordered portions of the cloaca cleared and reconnected to modern drains, part of an attempt to control the Tiber's flooding. The sewer was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a historical relic with practical use, a rare intersection of scholarship and sanitation. Enlightenment and engineering. By the 18th and 19th centuries, urban Europe began to confront its own sanitation crises. Cities like London, Paris, and Naples faced epidemics linked to poor sewage. Engineers, seeking models for modern systems, looked to the Romans. The Cloaca Maxima became a case study. Engineers measured its slope, its vault dimensions, its longevity. They were stunned to find that, in some places, Roman masonry had survived longer than most modern brickwork. In 1842, French engineer Eugene Belgrand, the mastermind behind the Paris sewer system, studied the Cloaca Maxima closely. His notes referenced Roman technique as both inspiration and warning, a testament to what was possible and what had been neglected. The rise of modern civil engineering owed more than a passing nod to the hidden tunnels beneath the eternal city. We have seen how the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's greatest sewer, emerged from marshy beginnings to become one of the most quietly influential structures in the empire, shaping how people lived, bathed, relieved themselves, and stayed alive. In this final section, we examine the decline, rediscovery, and legacy of this subterranean marvel. For even as Rome itself crumbled and rose again, the sewer endured, adapting to new powers, new religions, and new ways of living. In its stubborn persistence, the Cloaca Maxima reflects something remarkable: not the heroism of Rome, but its maintenance and the strange immortality of the systems meant to deal with our most mortal needs. Collapse is not always sudden. The fall of Rome, as modern historians often remind us, was not a single event, but a gradual transformation. The Cloaca Maxima mirrored this reality. As the Western Roman Empire declined in the 5th century CE, the sewer system continued to function, but without the central management, tax base, and civic order that had once supported it. The public aediles who oversaw infrastructure disappeared. Wealthy patrons were fewer. Slave labor, which had handled much of the dirtiest maintenance, became scarce. Still, the cloaca flowed. Why? Because gravity doesn't require politics. Because even in the absence of organized governance, waste still needs somewhere to go. And because the Roman design was, at its core, remarkably resilient. While fountains dried and bathhouses fell silent, Water runoff and household waste still trickled into the sewer's ancient channels. The grand system may have dimmed, but its bones remained quietly absorbing the everyday refuse of a world in flux. The medieval sewer, Cloacian cloisters. In the medieval period, Rome's population shrank drastically from over 1 million in the imperial age to perhaps as few as 30,000 by the 10th century. The city became a patchwork of ruins, villages, and fortified compounds, nestled among toppled columns and open fields. In this smaller Rome, the Cloaca Maxima continued to serve. Monasteries and churches rose over the ruins of old forums. Medieval engineers, though lacking the ambitions of the Caesars, adapted what remained. New drains were dug. Old channels were reused. The cloaca, though no longer maintained with imperial regularity, persisted as a natural outlet for runoff. Wealthy religious institutions often had private latrines, some of which connected into older Roman sewers. In some cases, catacombs and crypts were built atop or near these channels where decay, death, and drainage all shared the same underground air. During major floods of the Tiber, waste from the cloaca sometimes backed up into these sacred spaces, reminding even the most pious that filth is never far from holiness. Rediscovery in the Renaissance. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as Renaissance thinkers turned their eyes back to antiquity, the Cloaca Maxima began to attract new attention not as a working sewer, but as a monument of ancient engineering. Artists, architects, and antiquarians toured the system. Leon Battista Alberti, an early theorist of architecture, praised its structure. Others measured its width, traced its path, and commented in awe at the massive stones still holding firm after 1,000 years. For the Renaissance imagination obsessed with geometry, order, and the revival of Roman ideals, the sewer became a metaphor, proof that even the hidden, dirty parts of civilization could be beautiful. A few writers even praised the Cloaca Maxima as Rome's greatest accomplishment, greater than the Colosseum or the Pantheon, because it served everyone and expected no applause. Still, the sewer remained largely invisible to everyday Romans. Most were unaware of what flowed beneath their feet. Its greatest compliment was its silence. Into the age of science, filth as disease. The Enlightenment and Industrial Age brought a new awareness of sanitation. As cities like London and Paris ballooned in size, they began to experience the same problems Rome had faced: overcrowding, filth, and disease. By the 19th century, the idea of public sanitation as a civic duty returned with force. Engineers in Britain and France studied ancient Roman texts, analyzed sewer plans, and held up the Cloaca Maxima as a historical model not to imitate precisely, but to understand how a society once attempted to manage urban hygiene. Ironically, modern science revealed that Rome had misunderstood the causes of disease. Miasma theory, the idea that foul smells caused illness, had guided Roman sanitation. We now know that it is pathogens, not odor, that spread infection. Still, Roman methods removing waste, promoting flow, separating clean water from dirty, accidentally achieved many health-positive outcomes. In this way, the Cloaca Maxima was both outdated and ahead of its time. The sewer as symbol. By the modern era, the Cloaca Maxima became more than infrastructure. It became symbolic. Writers and poets began referencing it in literature, often as a metaphor for hidden corruption, forgotten power, or the unseen underworld of civilization. For example, 19th century writers visiting Rome described the cloaca as the city's artery of history, carrying not just filth but memory. Urban theorists discuss the sewer as a kind of civic unconscious, a structure that reflected how a society deals with what it wants to forget. In Rome's case, it was an elegant repression, filth made to vanish, without scandal, in stone tunnels older than Christendom. Even tourists began to visit it. Small segments of the Cloaca Maxima were open to viewing. Guides explained its history with pride. Rome, a city of palaces and piazzas, now boasted about its sewers. Archaeology and the science of dirt. In recent decades, the Cloaca Maxima has drawn the attention of archaeologists not only as an engineering marvel, but as a time capsule. Excavations in Rome and Pompeii have shown that sewage layers can preserve remarkable detail. Seeds from fruit, hair, fish bones, broken combs, and even scraps of cloth. One sewer near the baths of the philosopher in Herculaneum contained a perfect snapshot of household waste, revealing the diet, hygiene habits, and even illnesses of ordinary Romans. This field of study, known as archaeological biowaste analysis, has changed our understanding of ancient life. Sewers hold what history books leave out. They record the habits of the poor, the realities of digestion, the presence of parasites, and the fluctuations of trade, all in a sludgy archive. Ironically, the deeper we dig into Rome's sewers, the more clearly we see its people, not its emperors, but its bakers, washerwomen, and children. Echoes in the modern world. Rome today still grapples with infrastructure problems. Its water pipes, electrical conduits, and metro tunnels must navigate the ancient bones of the city. Engineers digging for a new train line routinely encounter Roman walls, mosaic floors, and buried drains. And below it all, parts of the Cloaca Maxima still flow. Though most of the ancient sewer has been bypassed by modern systems, a few segments remain connected, managing runoff from the Forum Boarium and surrounding streets. In this sense, the cloaca has never truly stopped working. Like time itself, it just keeps moving out of sight, out of mind, but always present. Its lesson is clear. A civilization is not only judged by its triumphs, but by how it deals with what it throws away. Rome, for all its brutality and spectacle, understood that filth must be managed, not ignored. That even waste deserves a channel, a system, a structure, and that beneath every palace lies a pipe. The unseen foundation. When we think of the Roman legacy, we tend to imagine arches, laws, roads, and armies. But the sewer, the most literal and metaphorical foundation of civic life, is rarely celebrated. Yet it is the Cloaca Maxima, not the Arch of Titus, that touches daily life. It made the city livable. It supported health, movement, cleanliness, and order, and it did so without fanfare. Perhaps that's the greatest Roman innovation, the ability to build structures so solid, so dependable that they are forgotten. Not because they failed, but because they did their job so well, they disappeared from view. So the next time you flush, rinse, or drain, think of Rome. Think of the stone-lined channel below the Forum. Think of the goddess Closina, patron of the purifiers, and wonder what traces of us will survive in the tunnels we leave behind. Story 3. The Water Carriers, Aqueducts, and the Quiet Revolution of Flow. To walk through the ruins of a Roman aqueduct is to encounter a structure so functional, so elegant, and so patient that it seems almost impossible. Miles upon miles of stone arches, marching through valleys, across plains, and even into cities carrying nothing but water. No treasure, no soldiers, no spectacle, just clean, flowing water. And yet, in this silent, consistent delivery of water, the aqueduct achieved something far greater than conquest. It was a revolution in quality of life, accomplished not with drama, but with gradient and gravity. While the Roman sewer carried civilization's waste away, the aqueduct brought it life. A thirsty beginning. Rome's early history was one of scarcity. Built atop hills above the Tiber, the city lacked reliable springs. The river was nearby, but its waters were muddy and often contaminated, particularly near the mouth of the Cloaca Maxima, where runoff and refuse flowed. In dry summers, even household wells ran low. By the 4th century BCE, this growing discomfort led to action. In 312 BCE, under the censorship of Appius Claudius Caecus, the Romans constructed the Aqua Appia, their first aqueduct. It was modest by later standards, only about 16 kilometers long and almost entirely underground. But it marked the beginning of something revolutionary, the permanent importation of fresh water from outside the city. It also signaled something else, a shift in what it meant to be a city. A Roman city would not merely sit by a river. It would reach into the countryside, capture distant purity, and bend it to the needs of the many. How the aqueduct worked. Roman aqueducts were marvels of low-tech genius. They required no pumps, no motors, just gravity, careful surveying, and long-term vision. Water was sourced from mountain springs or upland rivers, channeled into settling tanks to remove sediment, and then fed into a system of covered conduits, often stone or concrete-lined channels known as specus. The flow was steady, not rushing. Roman engineers aimed for a gentle gradient, typically around 1 in 4,800, meaning 1 foot of drop every 4,800 feet of distance. If the slope was too steep, water would erode the channel; too shallow, and the flow would stagnate. To maintain this perfect slope across varied terrain, engineers employed tunnels carved by hand through hills, bridges using stone arches to span valleys, siphons, when necessary, to cross depressions using gravity-fed pressure, distribution tanks, or casella, within cities to divide the flow among fountains, baths, and private users. All this built by hand without modern instruments, using groma and chorobate's basic leveling tools of wood and string. And yet, the results endure. A city of aqueducts. By the 1st century CE, Rome had at least 11 major aqueducts, bringing in an estimated 200–300 million gallons of water per day. Compare that to New York City in the 19th century, which managed about half that volume with modern technology. The major Roman aqueducts included Aqua Appia, 312 BCE, the first and largely underground; Anio Vetus, 272 BCE, sourced from the Anio River, longer and more ambitious; Aqua Marcia, 144 BCE, known for its cold, clear water favored for drinking; Aqua Claudia, 52 CE, among the most visually striking, supported by massive arches; Aqua Traiana, 109 CE, sourced from Lake Bracciano, feeding western districts. These channels often ran dozens of miles, with only the final leg raised on arches. The famous structures that modern visitors marvel at, such as the Pont du Gard in France or the towering remains of the Aqua Claudia outside Rome, represent only a small fraction of the entire system. Most of the aqueduct was invisible, buried underground, humming quietly beneath fields, roads, and neighborhoods. Who got the water? Access to water was both a right and a privilege in Rome. At the most basic level, aqueducts supplied public fountains known as lacus, often located at street corners or near markets. These flowed constantly, allowing anyone to fill containers or wash. The flow was not turned on or off, it simply ran. Next came public baths, which required massive volumes of water. The baths of Caracalla, for instance, demanded up to 6.5 million liters a day. Aqueducts enabled their operation, and with it, the Romans' famous love of daily bathing. But not everyone had equal access. Wealthy households, particularly senatorial families and elite domus, could request a private branch, or privatus rivis, piped directly from a casella. This required permission from the water commissioner, curator aquarum, and sometimes a bribe. Meanwhile, in densely packed insulae, many residents still relied on public fountains. Tenants sent slaves with buckets or paid water sellers, aquarii, to deliver it. In this way, the aqueduct system both equalized and reinforced social hierarchy. Water was everywhere, but it flowed more generously to those with influence. The water commissioner, curator aquarum. Managing this hydrological empire was no small task. The office of Curator Aquarum, established under Augustus, was among the most important administrative positions in Rome. The curator oversaw construction, maintenance, legal disputes, and even theft. Yes, water theft was a crime. This official often came from the senatorial class and was supported by a small army of engineers, surveyors, and workers. They monitored flow rates, inspected channels, repaired leaks, and prosecuted those who tapped into pipes unlawfully. Roman law included strict regulations around pipe size, connection points, and flow limits. Every user was assigned a calyx, a calibrated pipe nozzle that controlled the volume of water permitted. Illegal enlargement of a calyx could result in fines or punishment. This bureaucracy might seem dull, but it kept the system running for centuries. It also shows that the Romans did not view water as merely a gift from the gods, but as a managed resource, administered like grain, coin, or land. Sacred flow, water in the divine. For all their engineering, the Romans never fully secularized water. Aqueduct sources were often considered sacred springs, watched over by local deities or nymphs. Shrines were built at source points. Inscriptions offered thanks. Rituals marked the opening of new aqueducts. Even the terminus points, such as fountains, were occasionally adorned with statues of Neptune, Minerva, or water spirits. The Nymphaeum, a decorative public fountain, served both as infrastructure and a place of reverence. To pollute an aqueduct by bathing in it, disposing of waste, or defacing a fountain was not only illegal, it was sacrilegious. In this way, Rome combined practical necessity with spiritual obligation. Water was technical, yes, but also symbolic of Rome's vitality, purity, and power. Foreign waters, aqueducts beyond Rome. Aqueducts were not limited to the capital. Across the empire, Romans built water systems in cities as diverse as Nimes in Gaul, home of the Pont du Gard, a triple-tiered bridge of staggering beauty. Caesarea in Judea, with a system running along the coast, using siphons and bridges. Ephesus in Asia Minor, where aqueducts supplied the grand public baths. Londinium, Tarragona, Segovia, Carthage, and dozens more. Each was adapted to local geography. Some used terracotta piping, others relied on underground tunnels, but all shared the Roman belief that water must be harnessed and made to serve the city. This was more than infrastructure. It was a hallmark of Romanization. A city with an aqueduct was a city shaped in the Roman image, structured, disciplined, and modern. As water flowed through arches and into fountains, it carried not just refreshment but ideology. What happens then when the flow stops, when empire crumbles and stone grows dry? The aqueduct, as we've seen, was an engineering marvel stretching over hills, valleys, and political regimes with calm precision. But it was not enough to simply bring water to the edge of the city. The real magic happened in what followed: its distribution, usage, and absorption into daily life. In this section, we descend from the arches and springhouses to the streets, fountains, kitchens, and bathhouses where Roman water infrastructure became a vital pulse in the body of civic life. It was not only the aqueduct's construction that made it revolutionary, but its integration into how people lived, worked, and bathed. Into the city, from casella to corner fountains. Once an aqueduct reached the city perimeter, its water didn't flow randomly. It entered a distribution system, centered around casella, large settling tanks that served as junction points for dividing water into various pipes. A casellum was usually built on a raised platform and included an intake tank where water first arrived, overflow outlets to regulate pressure, calibrated pipe openings, which sent water into three main streams, public fountains, bathhouses, private users, wealthy homes, villas, businesses. Water rarely reached every corner with equal force. Gravity governed flow. Areas uphill or far from the casella received less pressure, Poor neighborhoods often relied on open fountains, while elite villas might boast pressurized plumbing and even indoor water features. But for most Romans, access meant public fountains, the city's true lungs. Fountains, the heart of the neighborhood. Roman fountains weren't decorative luxuries, they were essential utilities. Fed by aqueducts, these constantly flowing basins served as places to fetch drinking water, wash produce, clean clothes, cool off on hot days, exchange gossip and news. Most neighborhoods had at least one. Some had many. Fountains came in all shapes, from simple stone basins to elaborate nymphea decorated with columns, statues, and inscriptions. Many were located at intersections, becoming landmarks and social hubs. Because the water flowed continuously, users didn't wait for it to be turned on. They came with jugs, amphorae, or leather bags, filled them quickly, and returned home. For those in insulae without plumbing, this routine was a daily necessity. Slaves often did the hauling. In wealthier homes, designated staff might carry dozens of buckets per day. Water was heavy labor, and access even to a free resource often depended on who could lift and carry it. Inside the domus, luxury, privacy, and indoor flow. For the wealthy, aqueduct water arrived inside the home. A typical domus, a single-family Roman house, could have indoor fountains, small gardens with trickling rills, private baths, flush latrines, mosaic pools, and pluvia reused for water storage. These homes were fitted with lead piping, connected to the municipal supply. Lead plumbum was cheap, malleable, and effective, though we now know it posed health risks. Romans were aware of lead's dangers to some extent. The naturalist Pliny the Elder remarked on its toxicity, but widespread use persisted, likely due to lack of alternatives and misunderstanding of chronic exposure. Still, indoor plumbing was rare. It signaled status. It made water silent, available without labor, without waiting, and without public interaction. Where the poor carried their buckets, the rich turned taps or let fountains flow for aesthetics. Bathhouses, hydraulic wonders, and social engines. Public baths thermae were among the most intensive users of aqueduct water. A single large bathhouse could require millions of liters per day, feeding multiple pools, steam rooms, latrines, and decorative fountains. Baths were more than hygienic facilities. They were social centers, open to citizens of nearly all classes. For a small fee, often covered by the state, one could enjoy tepid pools, tepidarium; hot steam, caldarium; cold plunges, frigidarium; massages; exercise yards; reading rooms. Behind the scenes, a network of cisterns, lead pipes, furnaces, and channels kept water moving and heated. Wastewater was flushed out into the sewer system, sometimes directly into the cloaca maxima. Baths weren't just places to get clean. They were places where water shaped the rhythm of urban life, and where engineering enabled public luxury on a massive scale. Water and work, industries that flowed. Rome's water wasn't only for drinking and bathing. It powered industry. Aqueduct-fed water was used in phalanike laundries, where cloth was cleaned using water, ash, and urine collected in street pots. Tanneries, where hides were soaked and processed. Dye works, which needed reliable water for rinsing. Grain mills. Some aqueducts even powered water wheels in mills outside the city. These businesses often sat on the margins of town, near outflows or sewage lines. Their runoff was filthy, mixed with chemicals, dyes, and biological waste, and typically sent straight into the drainage system. While elegant fountains graced city centers, these utilitarian flows made urban life possible. Aqueducts weren't ornamental, they were economic arteries. Theft, leaks, and law. With so much water flowing constantly, abuse was inevitable. Water theft became a chronic problem. Some illicit users tapped into pipes, enlarged nozzles, or bribed inspectors. Others built unauthorized baths, fountains, or irrigation systems. To combat this, Roman law included fines for tampering with water infrastructure, inspections by aquarii, water overseers, penalties for enlarging your calyx, pipe connector, official seals on pipe fittings. One surviving law, inscribed on a stone tablet, warns: whoever removes, deflects, or taps the water unlawfully shall be fined 100,000 sestertii. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. In a city of millions, water was everywhere and nowhere flowing through public hands, slipping through cracks, and often lost to evaporation, leakage, or corruption. A delicate balance. The entire aqueduct system depended on constant, balanced flow. Interruptions due to earthquakes, sabotage, or poor maintenance could disrupt life for thousands. A broken aqueduct meant empty fountains, closed baths, and dry kitchens. That's why emperors like Augustus, Claudius, and Trajan invested heavily in restoration and expansion, often boasting of aqueduct repairs in inscriptions and coins. The message was clear: Rome's greatness flowed with its water. But what happens when the water stops? When the channels dry, the arches crack, and the city begins to forget what once ran through its veins? The Roman aqueducts had brought life to the city not just in water, but in motion, cleanliness, and a kind of civil order. With their arches, gradients, and hidden tunnels, they had come to symbolize the empire's mastery over nature. And yet, for all their ingenuity, the aqueducts were not eternal. Like everything in Rome, they faced the quiet unraveling of time. This final section explores what happened when the water stopped flowing, how the fall of the empire, the rise of new powers, and the realities of medieval life led to the decline, partial survival, and eventual rediscovery of Rome's water systems. And just as importantly, how the idea of the aqueduct lived on long after the water dried up. The cracks begin. Rome's aqueduct system required constant maintenance, inspection, and administrative oversight. For centuries, this was the work of the curator aquarum, supported by engineers, masons, and an army of laborers. But as the Western Roman Empire began to falter in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the city's infrastructure suffered. Civil wars, invasions, and shrinking revenues meant less investment in public works. Skilled laborers dwindled. Repair funds dried up. As the imperial bureaucracy receded, so did the authority needed to manage vast aqueduct systems. Some aqueducts fell into disrepair gradually. Others were deliberately destroyed. The Goths, during the sack of Rome in 537 CE, famously cut the aqueducts feeding the city in order to weaken it. With no flowing water, the public baths closed. Fountains fell silent. Disease crept in. For the first time in centuries, Rome became thirsty. Medieval Rome, a city without flow. By the 6th century CE, the eternal city had become a shadow of its former self. From a population of over 1 million, it shrank to less than 50,000. Whole neighborhoods were abandoned. Markets fell quiet. Marble was looted from ruins and repurposed for churches or lime kilns. Without regular repairs, aqueducts collapsed. Weeds grew through cracks. Birds nested in arches. Earthquakes and floods knocked segments loose. The once bright water that had crossed valleys on stone stilts now lay still in broken channels. Yet not everything disappeared. Some shorter aqueducts, or portions close to reliable springs, continued to function in limited ways. Monasteries and churches sometimes tapped surviving sections for local use. The Aqua Virgo, a 1st century aqueduct, remained partially operational and would later be restored to feed the Trevi fountain in the 18th century. Still, the vision of water freely flowing across cities to all classes, in every district, had vanished. In medieval Rome, water was again drawn from wells, cisterns, and the polluted Tiber. Changing attitudes toward water. As the physical system faded, so too did the Roman philosophy of water. The Romans had seen water as a public good, a right of citizenship, and a symbol of urban sophistication. But in the Middle Ages, many cities came to see water as something risky linked to disease, impurity, and even moral decay. Public baths, once popular gathering spaces, were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Concerns about nudity, promiscuity, and contagion, especially during plagues, led to their closure across Europe. Cleanliness became a private concern, and access to water became stratified again. The communal, civic nature of water use central to Roman urban life was replaced by isolation, scarcity, and local improvisation. Stones in the field, the ghosts of the arches. Even as their function faded, the physical remains of aqueducts endured. In the countryside around Rome, great arcades still stretched across fields. Farmers plowed beside them. Shepherds sheltered beneath their shadows. The aqueducts became landmarks, often repurposed as defensive structures or quarried for stone. In France, the Pont du Gard near Nimes survived by being converted into a bridge. In other parts of the former empire, fragments of aqueducts became foundations for new buildings or even incorporated into castle walls. Yet they were not fully understood. Locals often assumed they were remnants of ancient roads or sacred monuments. Few remembered the logic of gradients, flow rates, or casella. The system had become a mystery, visible but forgotten. Renaissance revival, wonder and utility. By the 15th century, Rome's ruins began to attract curiosity. Humanist scholars and engineers examined the remains of aqueducts, attempting to understand their purpose. Artists sketched them. Architects measured their spans. The aqueduct, long dismissed as a relic of pagan Rome, became a symbol of reason, an order and embodiment of lost knowledge. This reverence led to restoration efforts. Pope Nicholas V, 1440–1455, ordered repairs to the Aqua Virgo. Pope Sixtus V, 1585–1590, launched large-scale renovations of old Roman channels. New papal fountains, such as the Fontana dell'Acquafelis, marked the return of water to Roman streets. These projects weren't just nostalgic, they were practical. As Rome grew again, its people needed water, and so the ancient infrastructure, reinterpreted and updated, came back to life. The idea that endured. Even where aqueducts were not physically rebuilt, the Roman model of water supply inspired cities for centuries to come. In 19th century Britain, urban planners studied Roman systems as models of municipal water management. In Paris, engineer Eugene Belgrand helped modernize the city's sewers and aqueducts, directly referencing Roman designs. In the Americas, colonial cities often used gravity-fed aqueducts based on Roman principles. The aqueduct had become more than a ruin. It had become an idea, a blueprint for how cities should work. It reminded modern planners that water should not just be present but integrated, reliable, and universal. That engineering is not just about dams and pipes, but about trust and time. The Trevi Fountain, the final whisper. Today, the Trevi Fountain, perhaps the most iconic fountain in the world, is fed by a remnant of the Aqua Virgo, first built in 19 BCE. Tourists toss coins into its basin. They pose for pictures. They make wishes. Most do not know that the water flowing behind the statues travels along a path laid down more than 2,000 years ago. It is the last functional link in a once sprawling system. But its presence is not just decorative, it is proof that the Roman vision of water still flows in pipes, in principles, and in the collective memory of cities. What remains? The Roman aqueducts have long since ceased to feed the baths of Caracalla or the fountains of the Forum, but their legacy persists, in the expectation that cities should provide water to all. in the understanding that public health depends on infrastructure, in the belief that engineering can be beautiful, even when invisible. They remind us that a civilization does not simply conquer land or draft laws. It also delivers water quietly daily, without applause. That beneath every thriving city is a system of channels, slopes, and silent tunnels, carrying the weight of modern life in drops and rivulets. So when the last aqueduct finally cracked, when the last fountain ran dry, did Rome fall with a shout or with the quiet drip of a broken pipe? Story 4. Insulae and Domus: How the Romans Lived. Roman life is often imagined in marbled halls, sun-dappled atriums, and columned courtyards. But for most residents of Rome, daily life unfolded in creaking stairwells, shared latrines, smoky kitchens, and small, rented rooms. The sharp divide between the insulae Roman apartment buildings and the domus elite single-family houses was more than just architectural. It reflected the very social architecture of the empire itself. This section explores the physical structures of Roman dwellings, how they were built, where they were placed, what they offered, and who lived within their walls. Like the sewers and aqueducts, these homes formed the invisible skeleton of daily life. The insula, the apartment block of antiquity. The Latin word insula means island, and originally referred to a city block. Over time, it came to describe the multi-story apartment buildings that dominated Rome's urban skyline. Early high-rises, packed with humanity and prone to fire, collapse, and overcrowding. By the 1st century CE, Rome was teeming with insulae. Estimates suggest there were over 40,000 of them, compared to about 1,800 domus. These buildings were 3 to 6 stories high, sometimes even more, despite legal height limits. Constructed from wood, brick, and concrete, often poorly built. Home to dozens, sometimes hundreds of people in a single structure. The lowest floors often held shops or taverns, with slightly larger apartments above them. The higher one climbed, the smaller and cheaper the rooms became. At the top were cramped, attic-like units, hot in summer, freezing in winter, and far from the nearest water source. The rich might own an entire insula as an investment. The poor rented space, sometimes just a room or even a bed in a shared unit. Inside the insula, a closer look. An average insula was not luxurious, but it was functional. A mid-level apartment might include a single main room, with a small alcove or sleeping area. No kitchen: most people cooked over portable braziers, or bought hot food from popine. No latrine: residents used chamber pots, emptied in the street or shared privies. One window, if any, looking out onto a courtyard or street. The walls were thin, and fire was a constant danger. Cooking indoors with charcoal could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning, and the buildings themselves could collapse under their own weight. Several emperors issued decrees limiting the height of insulae. For instance, Augustus set a cap at 70 Roman feet, about 20 meters, but these were often ignored. Tenants shared stairs, walls, smells, and sounds. Privacy was limited. Life was lived in public, in streets, markets, baths, and temples, because home was rarely a refuge. The Subura, a district of densities. One of the most infamous insula-dense areas was the Subura, a crowded, lively, and sometimes dangerous district nestled between the Esquiline and Viminal hills. The Subura was home to artisans and shopkeepers, beggars and entertainers, prostitutes, actors, and students, freedmen and day laborers. It was noisy, dirty, and bustling, alive at all hours. Residents shouted from windows, tossed slop into the street, and argued over stairwell access. Despite its reputation, the Subura was not a slum. It was a working-class neighborhood, full of ambition and movement. It sat in the shadow of imperial grandeur, close to the Forum but far from its luxury. In a sense, the Subura powered Rome, housing the people who cleaned, cooked, built, and served. The domus, houses of the elite. In contrast, the domus was a horizontal structure, sprawling out rather than up. It housed a single extended family, along with slaves, clients, and sometimes guests. Typical features included a vestibulum entryway leading into the atrium, an open-air central hall with a rainwater collecting pool impluvium, and an opening in the roof compluvium. Cubicula bedrooms, often small and windowless. A tablinum, the master's office, where business was conducted. A peristyle garden with columns and fountains. A triclinium, the dining room for reclining meals. Private baths, kitchens, and storerooms. The domus was both private home and public display. Wealthy Romans used it to host clients, show off art and lineage, and reinforce social hierarchy. Floors were paved in mosaic, walls painted with frescoes, and gardens filled with marble statues. Slaves lived in small rooms or slept near their masters. The entire household was a miniature empire, with the paterfamilias at the top. Location as status. Where you lived in Rome spoke volumes. The Palatine Hill housed emperors and the elite. The Aventine became associated with the plebeians. The Esquiline and Caelian hills were mixed some domus, many insulae. The Subura, as noted, was dense and working class. The Campus Martius, once a military field, evolved into a vibrant neighborhood of theaters, baths, and housing. Urban planning did not strictly separate rich and poor, but elevation often correlated with status. Living higher in both senses meant more wealth, more air, more light, and more access. But proximity also mattered. A domus near the forum gave access to politics. An insula near a market made commerce easier. Rome's geography reflected a functional mingling of class and space, unlike later walled European cities. Rent ownership and the economics of housing. Most Romans were renters. A room in an insula might cost 100–400 sesterces per year, depending on size and location. That was a substantial part of an average laborer's income, leaving little for other expenses. Rent could be paid in coin or kind. Leases were informal. Evictions were frequent. Fires could destroy homes overnight and often did. Landlords could be wealthy senators or corporations. They rarely lived on site. Instead, agents collected rent, enforced rules, and managed repairs, or didn't. Some insulae were held as real estate investments, with multiple buildings under a single owner. The domus, on the other hand, was usually family property, passed down through generations or acquired through wealth and political connections. Its value lay not only in comfort but in reputation. Beyond the city, villas and rural retreats. While city life was dense, many elites also owned villas outside Rome along the coast, in the countryside, or near resort towns like Baiae or Tibur, Tivoli. These villas ranged from working estates, villi rustici, which produced olive oil, grain, or wine, to luxury retreats, villi urbanae, where owners hosted poetry readings, parties, and political meetings. Famous villas include Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex of baths, libraries, and artificial lakes. Pliny the Younger's villas, which he described in letters with careful attention to layout and views. For the elite, the villa was an escape from city heat, noise, and obligations. For the enslaved workers and servants, it was simply another post of labor. Architecture and aspiration. Even among the poor, there was a desire to rise. Climbing from a rented attic room to a street-facing shop, or from an insula to a shared domus, meant status. Owning a home, even a small one, was a mark of freedom and pride. This aspiration drove migration, hustle, and savings. In a way, Roman housing embodied the tension of the empire, a world where order and ambition lived side by side, where dignity could be found in four shared walls, and where collapse and comfort were often only a floor apart. Above the street, behind every cracked wall and fading fresco, Roman lives unfolded layered, lit by oil lamps, warmed by charcoal and shaped by how high, how wide, and how dry a roof could be. But how long could these buildings stand, when the people changed faster than the stones? Having explored the physical structures of the insulae and domus, we now turn inward to the lives lived within their walls. Roman housing was more than architecture. It was a reflection of daily rhythms, class divisions, privacy, noise, and survival. This section walks through the spaces where Romans cooked, slept, prayed, argued, hosted, and endured. The walls may have been stone or wood, but the life inside was made of clay lamps, smoke-streaked ceilings, oil-stained tunics, and the quiet shuffle of feet across mosaic or bare earth. This is not the history of emperors but of inhabitants. Light and dark, illumination in the ancient home. Whether in a cramped attic room or a palatial atrium, light was precious. Domus. These homes were designed around the central atrium and peristyle, which admitted daylight from above. The compluvium, a rectangular hole in the roof, let in both sun and rain, which collected in the impluvium below. Side rooms often had no windows at all, relying on doorways and open courtyards for illumination. Insulae. Apartments often had a single window, if any usually small, unglazed, and facing a noisy street or inner courtyard. Higher floors were darker and colder. Many rooms, particularly interior ones, were lit by oil lamps, which gave off a dim, flickering light and left walls soot-streaked. Lamps were fed with olive oil, sometimes scented. They were simple clay saucers with a wick. Wealthier homes used bronze or silver lamps, some suspended from chains, others mounted on stands. Yet even in the richest domus, illumination remained uneven. Shadows were part of life. Cooking and eating, fire, ash, and community. The act of preparing food in ancient Rome varied radically by class. In a domus, the kitchen culina was tucked near the back, often close to servant quarters. It was dark, smoky, and unventilated. Cooking was done on raised hearths or braziers using wood or charcoal. There were no chimneys. Fire was both a necessity and a risk. Cooks, often enslaved, worked long hours and endured intense heat, inhaling smoke daily. Food was stored in amphorae, baskets, or ceramic pots. Walls sometimes held iron racks for hanging meats or herbs. Wealthier homes might have granaries, small wine cellars, and pantry rooms. But refrigeration didn't exist. Ingredients were purchased fresh, often daily. In an insula, things were far more precarious. Many apartments lacked even a basic kitchen. Tenants cooked with portable braziers, which were dangerous in confined spaces. Fires were frequent. Smells of stewing lentils, grilled fish, or garlic drifted between thin walls. As a result, most city dwellers ate outside the home. Popani and Thermopolia street-side food stalls offered cheap meals. Stews, bread, porridge, olives, wine, and the ever-present garum, fermented fish sauce. Meals were typically simple and brief, especially for the poor. For the rich, however, food became theater. Dining as display, the triclinium experience. In the domus, dinner was a ritual of social performance. The triclinium, a formal dining room, featured 3 couches arranged around a central table. Guests reclined while slaves served food, poured wine, and played music. Meals could last for hours. Dishes were presented in courses, and conversation was carefully managed. Walls were decorated with frescoes, mythological scenes, still lifes, or garden imagery. Mosaic floors often depicted marine animals, theater masks, or Dionysian symbols. Light came from wall-mounted lamps or small braziers. The setting was intimate but calculated. Hosts showcased their wealth and education through exotic dishes, clever jokes, or poetic recitations. Yet behind the velvet curtain was a hierarchy. Slaves moved quietly, anticipating needs, and were rarely addressed directly. In stark contrast, those in an insula might eat cross-legged on a pallet. sharing a flatbread with a neighbor or spooning porridge from a shared bowl. Furnishing and decoration, walls that spoke. The Romans valued decor, both for beauty and messaging. Walls. In wealthier homes, walls were covered with frescoes, painted in red, yellow, or black, often imitating marble panels. The four Pompeian styles ranged from simple colored blocks to elaborate rumpled architectural scenes. Floors. Mosaic floors ranged from geometric black and white tiles to intricate multicolored scenes. Popular motifs included marine life, gladiators, and theatrical masks. Even small homes sometimes invested in mosaics, though patterns were simpler. Statues and niches. Small household shrines, lararia, held figures of the Lares and Penates, the domestic gods. Offerings of wine, incense, or food were made daily. Wealthy homes might include busts of ancestors, marble copies of Greek statues, or elaborate altars. In insulae, walls were often bare or whitewashed. Some tenants painted simple symbols or pinned charms to their doorframes. Space was limited, but meaning was still layered. Sleep and space. Bedrooms cubicula were often tiny and unadorned, even in elite homes. Romans did not sleep in grand, plush rooms. Instead, beds were wooden frames with mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. Blankets were simple, pillows were rare. Bedrooms were dark, often with no windows. Privacy was relative curtains, not doors, often separated sleeping areas. Slaves might sleep on straw mats near the kitchen or in narrow corridors. In insulae, entire families could share a single room, cooking, sleeping, and eating within arm's reach of one another. Children often slept with parents or on the floor. Night offered few comforts, and many rose early to begin work or fetch water before the crowds. Heat and cold. The Roman climate indoors. Roman homes lacked insulation. Winters could be cold, especially in upper floors of insulae. Heating was done with braziers filled with charcoal. These were portable and dangerous. Many fires began this way. Wealthy homes sometimes used hypocaust systems, a kind of underfloor heating mainly in bathhouses, and a few luxurious villas. Windows had no glass, only wooden shutters. Cold air and smoke often filled the same room. Summers brought their own discomfort. In insulae, the upper floors became hotboxes, while the streets below filled with dust and noise. Sound and smell, the atmosphere of home. Roman homes were noisy places. Street vendors shouted below. Laughter and arguments passed through thin walls. Public announcements were made by criers. Music, footsteps, haggling, and hammering formed the city's soundtrack. And the smell, a combination of cooking oil, onions, fish sauce, waste chamber pots, nearby drains, smoke, braziers, and kitchens, perfume and incense, especially in elite homes. The olfactory landscape varied by district and class, but even the domus was not immune to the city's scent. Pets, pests, and the uninvited. Romans loved animals. Many homes kept dogs for guarding or companionship, cats, though less common, birds, particularly songbirds, occasionally monkeys or exotic pets among the rich. Inscriptions and mosaics warned, "Cave Canem, beware of the dog." But alongside pets came pests: mice, rats, lice, and fleas, insects in grain storage, mosquitoes in stagnant water. Cleanliness was a daily struggle. Even the wealthiest homes required constant labor to keep decay at bay. Domestic religion and ritual. Every home, regardless of wealth, maintained ritual space. The lararium, household shrine, was tended daily with small offerings. The hearth was sacred to Vesta, goddess of the flame. Ancestor masks and portraits were displayed in noble homes. Special rituals marked birthdays, marriages, deaths, and major festivals. Even in a rented attic room, A tenant might set up a tiny niche, light a candle, and murmur prayers for protection. The home, however humble, was seen as a sacred space, a site of continuity, tradition, and divine presence. In these rooms, smoky, crowded, echoing, and uneven, Romans ate, prayed, washed, aged, laughed, mourned, and endured. But in a city so packed with lives, how much of home could truly be one's own? The previous sections revealed how Romans lived, dined, slept, and prayed above smoky braziers, within crumbling stairwells, and under the carved ceilings of the elite. But buildings, like people, age and die. In this final section, we look at what happened when the homes began to fall, and how the memory of Roman domestic life was preserved, transformed, or forgotten in the centuries after the empire's decline. Rome's insulae and domus did not vanish overnight. They crumbled, were repurposed, built upon, or buried. Their ruins and floor plans still shape the skeleton of modern cities, and in the echoes of atria and the faint outlines of mosaics, we glimpse how the habits of living persisted long after the city had changed. The slow collapse of the insulae. When the Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate in the 5th century CE, Rome itself, once a city of perhaps over 1 million, began to shrink. Without centralized administration, fires went unchecked in crowded neighborhoods. Water supplies dried up or were deliberately cut during sieges, as with the Gothic Wars. Maintenance of apartment buildings ceased, staircases rotted, roofs collapsed. Renters abandoned upper floors, moving down or out altogether. As fewer people lived in the city, many insulae were left empty. They decayed rapidly. Bricks were pulled from walls and reused. Wooden beams were scavenged for firewood. Rats and vegetation moved in. In time, collapsed insulae became hills of rubble, later built over by medieval houses or churches. Their outlines faded, but their stones remained, layered beneath later generations. The fate of the domus. The fate of the domus was more complicated. Some elite houses were converted into ecclesiastical buildings, chapels, monasteries, or bishops' residences. Their walls were strong, their layouts flexible, and their gardens attractive to monks. Others were simply abandoned, especially those on the city's periphery. Like the insulae, they were quarried for marble and stone. Floor mosaics were stripped or painted over. Statues were defaced. Over time, dust and soil covered the peristyles, and new houses rose atop old ones. And yet, some survived in ghostly forms. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved under volcanic ash, entire domus complexes lay untouched for nearly 2 millennia. Their rediscovery in the 18th century revived the Roman home in the modern imagination. Domestic architecture after Rome. The post-Roman world did not forget how to build, but it did build differently. In the early medieval period, homes became simpler, smaller, and more defensible. The wide atria and open gardens of the domus were replaced by enclosed courtyards. Stone replaced wood, then gave way again to timber-framed houses in northern Europe. Glass windows became rare. Multi-story apartment blocks like the insulae vanished from most cities. Roman ideas of space, public versus private, display versus utility, shifted dramatically. In the Byzantine East, some elements of the domus lingered longer: mosaics, courtyards, wall paintings. But even there, the Roman home became a memory, not a model. The house's status, what was lost. Roman homes told the story of status through space. Domus architecture emphasized centrality, the atrium and tablinum at the heart, signaling power. Decoration reflected wealth and education. Frescoes of mythology, mosaics of theatrical masks, inscriptions quoting poets. Even the shape of a home could signal class: long rectangular floor plans for the elite, cramped cubicles for the poor. After Rome, status returned to being measured in land more than interior space. The house became less a performance venue and more a shelter. What was lost, perhaps, was not just the house but the philosophy of the house. A place not only to live, but to broadcast identity, host clients, and conduct daily rituals of public and private life. Rediscovery in the Renaissance and beyond. By the Renaissance, Rome's ruins began to stir interest. Early antiquarians crawled through the buried remains of Pompeii or walked among the crumbled facades of villas on the Palatine. As frescoes were uncovered, furniture reconstructed, and floor plans mapped, the idea of the Roman home was reborn. It wasn't just archaeological. Artists began painting scenes of Roman interiors, imagined conversations in atria, philosophers seated beside columns, slaves tending to baths. Architects referenced Roman floor plans in designing modern villas. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Pompeii became a site of grand tour and inspiration. Copies of Roman mosaics appeared in European homes. Wealthy families named their rooms triclinia and tablinia, even if only symbolically. The Roman home was no longer just a ruin. It became a template for taste, a language of elegance though often stripped of its original messiness and class stratification. What archaeology tells us. Modern archaeology has brought back the texture of Roman domestic life in remarkable detail. Carbonized bread found in kitchen ovens. Children's graffiti scratched on bedroom walls. Scorch marks from cooking braziers. Pet footprints embedded in drying mortar. Glass perfume bottles dropped behind beds. Shrines blackened by repeated incense offerings. These traces tell us what texts do not. How rooms were actually used, how people navigated space, what they valued and what they tolerated. For instance, studies of apartment buildings in Ostia Antiqua reveal that even insulae had diversity. Some units were surprisingly spacious, others little more than closets. One building might house a tavern, a family of 4, a widow, a prostitute, and a retired soldier all under one tiled roof. The sound of the absent. In walking the ruins of a domus today, one might marvel at the mosaic floors or frescoed walls, but the true silence lies in what is gone. The hum of early morning footsteps to the fountain, the buzz of cooking in the culina, the muttered prayers at the lararium, the snoring of children curled under coarse blankets, the creaking wood of an upper-floor stairwell, the arguments over space, rent, and noise. These were homes not just of glory but of domestic friction, of endurance, compromise, and adaptation. Their inhabitants were not marble heroes, but ordinary people managing light, smoke, hunger, privacy, and hope. The hidden continuities. Despite their collapse, Roman homes have shaped how we think about living space. The idea of an open central courtyard persists in Mediterranean architecture. Apartment blocks, after centuries of absence, returned to cities in the modern era. The separation of public and private rooms, of kitchen from reception, still informs home design today. Even the household altar in some form echoes in modern religious corners, family photographs, or personal shrines. Rome's domestic design did not vanish, it sank into cultural memory, waiting to be recalled, reinterpreted, and rebuilt. The homes of Rome are gone, but the way people lived within them still echoes layered into our walls, passed in silence between windows, and imprinted in the unseen rituals of waking, eating, and sleeping. When a building dies, does the life it held die too, or does it move quietly into the next set of walls? Story 5. Markets of Marble and Mud, the Forum and the Hidden World of Roman Commerce. If you had walked into the Forum Romanum in the late 2nd century CE at the height of the Roman Empire, you would have stepped into a space unlike any other in the ancient world. Not merely a market or square, the Forum was a city's memory, stage, and economic lung. Its marble porticos whispered of triumphs past. Its paving stones echoed with the scuffed sandals of senators, merchants, and beggars alike. This wasn't just Rome's public square, it was the heartbeat of Roman identity, a space where politics, commerce, religion, and rumor all collided. In this section, we explore the Forum not as a museum of monuments but as a living space dense, noisy, and slow-moving. This is the daily history of marble and mud, patrician ambition and plebeian necessity, captured in the stalls, contracts, and footsteps of the Roman people. Not just a marketplace. When modern minds hear Forum, they may imagine a kind of open-air mall, but the Forum Romanum was far more complicated. Commerce certainly thrived here. Vendors hawked everything from vegetables and wine to scrolls, perfumes, and legal advice. But the Forum also contained basilicas, large covered halls, temples, law courts, statues, senatorial curiae, and commemorative arches. One could just as easily encounter a political riot or a funeral procession as a produce stand. While Rome had other, more specialized markets such as the Forum Boarium, cattle market, or Forum Halatorium, vegetable market, the Forum Romanum remained the symbolic center. If anything happened here, it mattered more. The geography of meaning. The physical layout of the Forum was uneven, reflecting centuries of adaptation. The Via Sacra, Rome's sacred road, ran through its length. To the north stood the Curia Julia, where the Senate convened. On the southern edge sat the Basilica Julia, a massive structure where legal and commercial business took place. To the west loomed the Temple of Saturn, once the treasury of the Roman state. In the center, near the rostra, magistrates addressed the crowd. But beyond the monuments were the people, merchants setting up tables before dawn, scribes selling their services, barbers shaving customers in the open air, pickpockets gliding through crowds, and messengers darting from official to official. Beneath Rome's grandeur lived a city of improvisation. A day in the Forum. Imagine you arrive at dawn. Mist still lingers. The marble columns are cool to the touch. A baker's assistant shuffles past, arms full of loaves. Slaves are sweeping the paving stones. A crier shouts out public announcements, perhaps the result of a recent court case or a notice about a missing goat. Soon, vendors begin arriving. A seller of wax tablets and styluses arranges his goods on a low plank between two columns. A fruit merchant sets baskets of olives and figs on the ground, swatting at flies. A scribe posts his rates, will write legal contracts, love letters, or funeral inscriptions, discretion guaranteed. Children dart between legs. Magistrates, attendants clear space as their masters arrive. In a shady corner, a philosopher begins lecturing mostly to pigeons. Nearby, a man buys a cheap tunic from a traveling seller who claims it's Egyptian linen. It's not. All the while, the buzz of speech, Latin, Greek, and perhaps some Phoenician, rises like heat from the stones. The legal marketplace. The Forum was as much a court as it was a commercial center. Within the Basilica Julia, citizens handled legal proceedings, especially civil cases like property disputes, inheritances, and contracts, registrations for births, marriages, and manumissions, negotiations of loans and debt settlements. Judges, clerks, advocates, and bystanders packed the basilicas. One didn't need a license to plead a case, only a strong voice and a convincing argument. Lawyers, advocati, were often freelance professionals, paid in gifts or under-the-table fees. Successful ones earned reputations, and many began their careers here before climbing into politics. For the poor, justice was more elusive. A bad debt might mean enslavement or loss of livelihood, and there was little sympathy from the courts. Everyday transactions. Not every deal was written in wax. Most commercial activity happened verbally and informally, though bound by social expectation and Roman custom, mos maiorum. Common transactions in the Forum included buying grain, oil, or wine by weight or volume, often from itinerant sellers. Hearing day laborers, builders, porters, or scribes who gathered near set meeting spots, renting storage space in nearby porticos or under staircases, commissioning household items like lamps, shoes, or furniture from artisans, paying taxes or bribes, sometimes in the same interaction. Prices were variable. No fixed sticker tags existed. Haggling was expected and ritualized and could take hours. For larger transactions such as buying a slave, a house, or a plot of land, contracts were drawn up and witnessed publicly, often in the basilica or under the eyes of a magistrate. Credit and risk. In a cash-scarce society, credit was vital. Moneylenders, argentarii, operated openly in the forum, seated behind small benches with ledgers, coins, and seal rings. Short-term loans were common, especially before festivals, elections, or harvests. Collateral might include property, personal items, or even a child's future labor. Interest rates varied, but could be exorbitant in times of crisis. Debtors were pursued aggressively. If one failed to pay, their name could be posted publicly, and social ruin followed. The laws around debt shifted over time. Some early protections were later eroded. At times, defaulting could lead to indentured servitude or public flogging. Still, many Romans navigated this system daily, juggling risk, trust, and necessity. Mud beneath the marble. Despite its monuments, the Forum was not pristine. After rain, it became slick with mud, especially before paved drainage was improved. During festivals, animal droppings, food waste, and discarded offerings piled up. Vendors bribed officials to maintain their stall space, and thieves used the crowd as cover. Stories of purse snatching and cloak cutting abound. When political tensions rose, the Forum turned dangerous. Angry mobs shouted down speakers. Opposing gangs, often hired by rival politicians, fought with clubs and fists. Blood was not uncommon. For all its grandeur, the Forum was deeply human, flawed, dirty, and alive. The Forum as theater. The Forum was also a stage. Elections were announced and celebrated here. Triumphal processions passed through. Funeral eulogies were delivered on the rostra, and statues of the deceased placed nearby. Senators sought the favor of crowds by walking the Forum in white togas, distributing bread, or whispering gossip. Philosophers and orators set up impromptu speeches, and performance artists mimicked the day's events. Satirists poked fun at officials, careful not to name names. For citizens without voice or vote, this spectacle was one of few ways to engage in political life. To be seen, even anonymously, was a kind of participation. Behind the scenes, behind the marble colonnades, shadow economies thrived. Prostitutes met clients in designated corners. Bribery, both minor and major, was commonplace. Forged documents, stolen items, and illicit goods circulated in back alleys. These were the necessary grease of urban life, tolerated so long as it remained discreet. The Forum was not morally pure. It was a space of transaction, and that included the unseen. The Forum was both everything and nothing, a place of memory and forgetfulness, grandeur and grit. Its monuments loomed eternal, but its life pulsed in the everyday, one grain sack, one legal argument, one whispered bribe at a time. If the Forum was Rome's face, then the real muscle behind its commerce was found elsewhere, in the river ports, grain warehouses, and brick-lined alleys stretching toward the Tiber. Behind the shouts of market traders and senators, an invisible infrastructure kept the city's stomach full, its lamps burning, and its vendors stocked. This was not the glamorous history of emperors and statues. It was the history of logistics, of boats arriving at dawn, ox-drawn carts groaning under ceramic amphorae, and thousands of workers whose names never made it onto tablets or triumphal arches. Section 2 dives into the networks that made the Forum possible. The docks at Ostia, the storehouses of Testaxio, and the humble scribes who tracked it all by hand. The port at Ostia, Rome's lifeline. Rome's survival as a city of over 1 million people depended entirely on imports, particularly of food. The nearest major port was Ostia, located about 20 miles downstream on the Tiber River. By the 1st century CE, Ostia had become a purpose-built port town, with deepwater harbors for large merchant ships, many coming from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa. Warehouses Horia, storing grain, olive oil, wine, and building materials. Customs offices regulating trade and levying duties. A population of dockworkers, sailors, shippers, and traders. To reduce congestion, Emperor Claudius constructed Portus, an even larger artificial harbor adjacent to Ostia. Later expanded by Trajan, it featured a hexagonal basin still visible today. From ship to city, the river journey. Once goods arrived at Ostia or Portus, they had to travel upriver to Rome. River barges were loaded with amphorae or grain sacks. These barges were often towed by teams of men or oxen, walking along towpaths beside the Tiber. The trip could take 2-3 days, depending on river conditions. Upon arrival in Rome, goods were unloaded at Emporia River docks, located south of the Aventine Hill. The busiest area was Testaxio, a district named after Mount Testaxio, a man-made hill of broken amphorae. Over centuries, layers of smashed olive oil jars accumulated into a silent monument to mass consumption. Horia, the Roman warehouse system. Rome's goods didn't go straight to shops. First, they were sorted into state or privately owned warehouses, known as horia. These buildings were constructed of brick and concrete, often with multiple floors. Ventilated with narrow windows to prevent spoilage. Divided into individual storage rooms with wooden or iron doors. The most famous, the Horia Galbi, stored olive oil, grain, and wine. Some Horia belonged to the state, others were operated by guilds, shipping families, or wealthy merchants. Each amphora, sack, or crate had to be inscribed, counted, and cataloged, sometimes marked with paint, wax seals, or metal tags. Scribes sat at small desks, writing on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, maintaining ledgers for shipments and stock. Olive oil, grain, and garum, Rome's daily fuel. 3 staples defined the Roman food economy. Grain fermentum, imported mainly from Egypt and North Africa. Distributed as part of the annona, the state-subsidized grain dole to Roman citizens. Stored in large granaries with elevated floors and ventilation shafts. Olive oil oleum, mostly from Hispania Baetica, modern Andalusia. Shipped in large amphorae with pointed bases, which were stacked efficiently in ships and warehouses. Used for cooking, lighting, cosmetics, and cleaning. Garum fish sauce, a pungent fermented sauce made from fish offal and salt. Traded in tightly sealed jugs. Highly valued, there were cheap and luxury varieties, with known brands. These items, and others like wine, dried fruits, salt, and spices, moved in bulk through Rome's ports and warehouses, then dispersed via mule, cart, or porter. The business of moving things. Transport in Rome was regulated and often chaotic. Carts were banned from city streets during daylight hours to avoid traffic jams. Deliveries were often made at night, under torchlight. Porters Saccharina carried goods on their backs through alleys and stairwells. Guilds Collegia controlled labor, dockworkers, mule drivers, packagers, and more. Most transport businesses operated with tight margins. A delay in delivery could cause spoilage, theft, or a missed festival, which in turn might cause a riot. In an empire without refrigeration, time was survival. Storage as power. Owning a warehouse wasn't just about rent, it was about control. Wealthy Roman families like the Caecilii, Claudii, and Domitii owned and rented Horea to traders and guilds. This gave them leverage in supply chains, especially for high-demand goods. During food shortages, they could hold back supply to inflate prices, sell to the state at negotiated rates, favor political allies with priority goods. The state, too, used storage strategically, ensuring the grain dole ran smoothly meant social peace. Interrupting it could lead to violent unrest, as seen during the grain shortages of the late Republic. The people behind the goods. Hidden behind every transaction were thousands of laborers, scribes and tally clerks, often enslaved or freedmen, working by lamplight in warehouse offices, coopers who made and repaired barrels, amphora makers whose stamps tell us the story of trade, mule drivers hauling cargo through mud and cobblestone, shipbuilders, carpenters, net makers, and torch bearers. Rome's economy ran not just on capital, but on muscle, sweat, and careful bookkeeping. Most of these workers never saw the forum, but without them, the forum would have emptied in days. Commercial guilds and collegia. To manage risk and labor, many professions organized into collegia, guild-like associations. Examples included Collegium Navicularum, shipowners, Collegium Pistorum, bakers, Collegium Olarium, oil dealers. Guilds maintained charters, burial funds, and sometimes shrines. Members paid dues and elected officers. While technically private, some collegia held tremendous influence, especially if tied to political patrons. The government alternately regulated and co-opted them depending on the political climate. Fraud, spoilage, and risk. Every step in the supply chain had pitfalls. Amphorae cracked during unloading. Mice and mold ruined grain stores. Watered wine and counterfeit garum were common scams. Bribes to inspectors ensured shipments passed quickly or uninspected. Some merchants built reputations for honesty, others profited through tricks, but the lack of modern preservation meant spoiled goods were an everyday concern. Even public storage facilities sometimes suffered from corruption, with missing grain or falsified inventories. Rome's garbage, Mount Testaccio. No story of Roman commerce is complete without Mount Testaccio, Rome's forgotten garbage dump. Made up entirely of broken olive oil amphorae, the hill grew over centuries as used containers were systematically smashed and stacked. The jars came primarily from Spain. Each fragment often bears a stamp or inscription, the maker, origin, inspector, or weight. The hill itself reached over 100 feet high, a testament to consumption. Today, it offers scholars a cross-section of trade, like a barcode of the ancient economy. Rome buried its past, sometimes quite literally. Rome's glory stood on marble, but its survival depended on mud, labor, and the logistics of clay jars. Long before the Forum bustled with shoppers, the docks had already stirred. In every sail, behind every coin, stood a chain of hands and backs stretching from Iberian groves to Egyptian fields. Still, trade didn't stop at food. The next section explores the Forum's luxury economy: perfumes, silks, gemstones, and the quiet power of status-driven spending. By now, we've walked through the mud of the Forum, traced the flow of grain from Egyptian ships to Horea, and glimpsed the army of anonymous laborers who fed the Roman appetite. But what of those whose appetite was for more than bread and oil? While Rome's poor survived on subsidized grain, its elite and aspirational middle class engaged in a separate economy, one of status, indulgence, and visual proof of success. This was an economy where a bottle of perfume or a bolt of silk could communicate more than 1,000 words. Here, reputation, display, and luxury consumption weren't indulgent, they were strategic. In Section 3, we follow the flow of luxury goods, from the Silk Roads to Sabine villas, from opulent market stalls to the dimly lit private rooms where fortunes were gambled over oysters and glass cups. This was Rome's quiet addiction to beauty, and it shaped empires as much as any army ever did. The forum's high-end corners. Amid the rough and tumble of daily trade, the forum also hosted more specialized vendors. In shaded arcades or near major basilicas, one could find spice sellers offering pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, and asafoetida from Persia. Perfumers selling oils imported in tiny alabaster vials from Syria or Alexandria. Gem cutters who dealt in sapphires, emeralds, and garnets, many sourced from as far as India or Nubia. Textile merchants with bolts of imported silk, dyed wools, and fine linens from Egypt. These items weren't necessities. They were symbols proof of travel, connections, and wealth. Even the act of browsing such wares became a performance. Clients arrived in togas edged in purple, trailed by slaves, inspecting with exaggerated disinterest. The silk that scandalized the Senate. Few goods captured the Roman imagination like silk. Imported from China, often via intermediaries in India or Persia, silk arrived as thread or finished cloth, light, shimmering, and exotic. The elite draped themselves in silk garments during feasts and festivals. Women's gowns were said to be barely thicker than mist. Emperors wore silk-trimmed cloaks during triumphs. But not everyone approved. In 14 CE, Seneca the Elder lamented how men were dressing like women in transparent Eastern filth. Pliny the Elder, too, railed against how many coins left the empire, never to return, all in pursuit of cloth. Yet despite disapproval, demand only grew. Silk became not just fashion, but geopolitics, a reason to expand trade routes, and a drain on Roman silver. Shopping as spectacle. Rome's elite didn't buy things privately. Purchasing was often public performance. A wealthy man might inspect jewelry under torchlight during an evening market, throw coins to bystanders to demonstrate generosity, purchase entire banquet spreads to one-up a rival, send a servant back to return an item not because of price, but for a better color. To buy was to declare, "I have arrived," and to return a purchase was to whisper, "I can afford to be capricious." The shops of Via Sacra and Subura. While the Forum was the symbolic center, much high-end trade occurred just outside it, especially along the Via Sacra, where artisan shops lined the sacred route. The Subura, a chaotic but vibrant district blending wealth and crime. Here, glassmakers sold colored vessels. Bookshops offered scrolls with the latest poetry. Art dealers displayed miniature statues of gods or emperors. Money changers stood ready with scales and weights. The Subura, while infamous for its noise and vice, attracted clientele with its exotic imports. Think of it as a chaotic luxury bazaar, nestled within Rome's underbelly. The luxury of dining. Romans defined themselves through what and how they ate. Lavish feasts could include oysters from Bay, dormice fattened in jars and roasted with honey, flamingo tongues, a delicacy of questionable taste but high prestige, garum aged in amphorae stamped with a merchant's signature. Hosts competed to offer rare dishes, often pairing meals with entertainment music, recitations, dancers, or mimes. Dining rooms triclinia became temples of wealth, marble mosaics underfoot, frescoes on walls, reclining couches imported from Greece. Even the tableware cups of blown glass, plates of silver, utensils of ivory spoke volumes. Slaves and status. The luxury economy was not just about objects but people. Wealthy Romans employed hundreds of enslaved individuals, trained in cooking exotic dishes, dressing their owners in intricate styles, managing ledgers and trade correspondence, singing, dancing, or reciting poetry. Slaves were branded, bought, sold, or gifted. A skilled slave from Greece could fetch a higher price than a house. Some freedmen, once manumitted, became powerful traders or patrons in their own right, especially in luxury crafts like goldsmithing, textile work, and perfume blending. The emperor's example. The emperor was the trendsetter in Roman consumption. Augustus claimed to live modestly, but gifted his friends pearls the size of plums. Nero was infamous for building a rotating dining room and ordering feasts with perfumed snow falling from the ceiling. Domitian commissioned entire temples plated with gold leaf and demanded purple-dyed tunics, reserved by law for the emperor alone. Such excess wasn't mere vanity. It was ideology. Luxury displayed control, divine favor, and imperial distance from ordinary life. When emperors walked the forum adorned in gemstones, their splendor was meant to dazzle and intimidate. The cost of display. But Rome's luxury came at a cost. Imports drained silver and gold. Artisans and guilds became increasingly dependent on elite tastes. Land was diverted to vineyards and floriculture rather than wheat. Enslaved labor masked the system's unsustainability. Writers like Juvenal and Martial sneered at the upstart freedmen with silk pillows, while others romanticized a simpler, agrarian past. Still, the market grew. By the 3rd century CE, even provincial towns mimicked Rome's taste baths with mosaic floors, imported oils in rural villas, marble-lined latrines in cities like Trier or Leptis Magna. Art as asset. Artworks became both decoration and investment. Portrait busts of ancestors were displayed to emphasize noble lineage. Copies of famous Greek sculptures filled gardens and fountains. Painted frescoes depicted mythological scenes in ways that subtly flattered the homeowner. Wealthy buyers commissioned artists directly, choosing themes and even color palettes. Art wasn't just beauty, it was visual rhetoric. And much like today, owning the right piece became a marker of taste and education, not just income. What remains? So much of this luxury is invisible today. Silk has rotted, perfume has evaporated, the oysters were eaten, the glass shattered, the songs forgotten. But hints survive. Graffiti advertising auctions or luxury goods. Pottery stamps nomming perfume producers or wine vintages. Warehouse seals showing ownership by elite women or imperial family members. Inscriptions praising the virtue of lavish banquets or the generosity of donors. In these fragments, we glimpse an empire obsessed with display, status, and the performance of wealth. Rome sold itself one amphora, one scroll, one pearl at a time. But behind the gleaming veneer was a system straining to maintain its balance. For even as wealth flowed in from the provinces, inequality deepened and the costs of status rose. The Forum, for all its splendor, sat atop a foundation of contradiction. Opulence for some, scarcity for many, and a market always hungry for more. In the next story, we'll move beyond the Forum and into the engineering marvels that allowed a city of this scale to function at all. Because while markets kept people fed and fashionable, it was Rome's infrastructure, its aqueducts, roads, and sewers that truly made it possible to live. Story 6. Aqueducts, cloaky and concrete. Rome's invisible infrastructure. You stand on a dusty Roman road, the sun high and relentless. There's no sound but the breeze rustling the scrub and the distant clop of sandals. But if you stop and listen, really listen, you might hear something else. A faint, consistent hush, like a stream through stone. It's water traveling miles across hills and valleys, enclosed in a channel just above your head. This is Rome's aqueduct system, and it did more than supply fountains. It fed an empire's body and ego alike. Behind its sleek arcades and grand arches were centuries of trial, error, and engineering genius, all built to answer a simple, urgent need: how to bring water from the mountains to a city of over 1 million thirsty people. Rome did not grow because of water. It grew because it learned how to move water quietly, constantly, and over incredible distances. The problem of the dry hills. Rome's geography was not ideal. Built atop 7 hills, the early city lacked easy access to fresh springs or rivers. The Tiber, though nearby, was muddy, flood-prone, and brackish, often unusable for drinking. The earliest Romans relied on wells, rainwater cisterns, and a few local springs. By the time of the Republic, this wasn't enough. Public baths were expanding. Fountains were central to civic life. Wealthy households demanded flowing water, and sanitation required a steady and massive water source. The solution was clear but daunting. Bring water from the mountains through a network of aqueducts, across miles, with no pumps. How aqueducts worked without pumps. Roman aqueducts were gravity-fed systems. Water sources, mountain springs, rivers, or lakes, were located above the elevation of Rome. Engineers designed long, sloping channels, called specus, to bring water downhill over dozens of miles, maintaining a precise and gradual gradient as little as 1 foot drop per 300 feet of length. Aqueducts included underground tunnels, especially near the source. Raised arcades, the iconic stone arches used where valleys needed bridging. Bridges and siphons, built when terrain dipped dramatically. Settling tanks to remove sediment. Distribution towers, casella aquae, placed throughout the city to route water to various users. The water moved constantly, powered only by gravity and guided by astonishing accuracy. The Aqua Appia, Rome's first aqueduct. The first major aqueduct was the Aqua Appia, built in 312 BCE by Appius Claudius Caecus, who also commissioned the Via Appia, Rome's first major road. It ran about 10 miles. Nearly the entire length was underground, both for protection and ease of construction. It delivered water to low-lying areas of the city near the Forum. Though modest, it established a template Rome would solve engineering problems with stone, calculation, and persistence. The expansion of the aqueduct network. Over the centuries, more aqueducts followed. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, including Aqua Annio Vetus, 272 BCE, much longer and with a higher elevation than Appia. Aqua Marcia, 144 BCE, famous for delivering cool, pure water. It ran over 57 miles and remained in use for centuries. Aqua Claudia, 52 CE, one of the most visually impressive. It ran high atop massive arches. Aqua Traiana, 109 CE, brought water from Lake Bracciano and supported massive imperial baths. Combined, these aqueducts delivered an estimated 200–300 million gallons of water per day. Per capita, ancient Romans had more daily water access than many modern cities until the 20th century. Who used the water? Rome's water wasn't distributed equally. Public fountains, free and widespread, used by most of the population. Public baths, hugely popular, sometimes free to citizens. Latrines and sewers, required constant water flow for flushing. Private homes, only the wealthiest could pipe water directly into their homes, usually through bribery or imperial favor. Imperial buildings, palaces, temples, and government complexes had abundant, clean water. Water was not metered. Once connected, flow was continuous unless shut off. This led to frequent theft, including illegal taps into main lines. Inspectors, called curators aquarum, tried to police this, but bribery was common and enforcement was spotty. Maintenance, an unseen army. Keeping water flowing meant constant maintenance. Mineral buildup, calcium carbonate, often clogged channels. Leaks developed in joints and seams. Vegetation, earthquakes, and erosion damaged structures. Graffiti and damage from vandals or thieves had to be addressed. Teams of full-time aquarii aqueduct workers patrolled routes, cleaned tunnels, patched breaks, and inspected bridges. Major repairs were sometimes engraved in stone, celebrating the officials or emperors who restored the flow. Even boring plumbing became a chance for political visibility. Challenges and solutions. Roman engineers weren't miracle workers, they had to adapt constantly. If a spring ran dry, they might reroute another. In hilly terrain, they used inverted siphons lead or ceramic pipes that dipped into valleys, using pressure to force water uphill again. To cross large valleys, they built massive bridges like the Pont du Gard in Gaul or the Aqua Claudia arches in Rome. Where sediment was high, they added settling tanks, small basins where water slowed so debris could fall to the bottom. They also mastered the use of concrete, allowing waterproof structures even underground. This concrete, made with volcanic ash, was durable and flexible, ideal for hydraulic engineering. Cultural and political impact. Water was more than survival, it was ideology. Emperors built aqueducts to demonstrate care for the people. Public baths became centers of Roman identity, open to all free citizens. Cities across the empire competed for aqueducts, a sign of Rome's investment in their importance. Frontinus, Rome's water commissioner under Nerva, even wrote a treatise, De Aquis Urbis Rami, boasting that Rome's aqueducts were superior to all the idol pyramids of the Egyptians. To be Roman was to have water. Where did it all go? Despite their scale and importance, most aqueducts fell into disrepair after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Invasions damaged key sections. Maintenance declined as taxes dried up. Local communities resorted to wells and rainwater once again. Some aqueducts remained in partial use into the Middle Ages, but most became quarries for building stone or were buried under new construction. Ironically, parts of modern Rome are still supplied by restored Roman aqueducts, especially the Aqua Virgo, which continues to feed fountains like the Trevi. Rome's aqueducts were invisible arteries, silent, steady, and essential. They didn't merely provide water, they made city life possible, shaping urban design, hygiene, and politics alike. Yet beneath their elegance was endless effort, measured slopes, patient stonework, and an empire's worth of upkeep. If the aqueducts represented the glory of Rome's engineering, the sewer system represented its necessity. Water brought life, but it also brought waste. 1 million people in a densely packed city meant not only grain and oil, but rot, runoff, refuse, and human filth. And yet, unlike many cities in antiquity, Rome didn't drown in its own sewage. At least, not entirely. From the city's earliest days, the Romans had built something rare. A functioning urban drainage system, a network of underground tunnels that carried wastewater, storm runoff, and filth out of the city and into the Tiber. Its name still echoes, the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, one of the oldest and most essential monuments of ancient Rome, used for centuries, often unnoticed, often taken for granted. The earliest efforts, from marsh to forum. Long before the emperors and their marble monuments, the area between Rome's hills was marshland. Rain and runoff collected in the low basin where the forum would later stand, making much of it unusable for construction. To drain it, the kings of early Rome, particularly Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus in the 6th century BCE, initiated a bold plan. Excavate a channel through the marsh, line it with stone, and carry the water to the river. This primitive sewer would eventually become the Cloaca Maxima, the backbone of Rome's underground infrastructure. It was initially open air, more of a drainage ditch than a sewer. Later roofed over, encased in stone barrel vaulting. Continuously maintained, expanded, and integrated into a broader system as the city grew. By the late Republic, the Cloaca Maxima was a fully enclosed conduit, large enough in places for a person to stand or even walk through. How the system worked. Rome's sewer system was gravity-fed, like the aqueducts. But while aqueducts flowed toward the city, sewers flowed away from it, ultimately into the Tiber River. The network included main sewers like the Cloaca Maxima, running under major streets and near key public areas. Smaller branches, feeding into the main line from markets, baths, temples, and residential areas. Latrines, both public and private, flushed by diverted aqueduct water. Drainage grates, built into roadways to carry away storm water. The system was not sealed or modern by our standards, but it worked well enough to prevent constant flooding, reduce disease risk, and support a dense population. Public latrines, the social side of sanitation. Rome's sewer system enabled a distinctly Roman institution, the public latrine, often located near baths, markets, or temples. Usually free to use, though sometimes funded by wealthy patrons. Built with long stone or marble benches, pierced with holes, no partitions, no privacy. A small gutter ran in front for cleaning the sponge, tersarium on a stick, the Roman version of toilet paper. Water from aqueducts flowed continuously through the latrine and into the sewer, washing away waste. Latrines were surprisingly social. People chatted, read graffiti, or conducted informal business. Some even treated them as places of reflection or community. But the design also served a practical purpose. A constant flush of water kept foul smells at bay, at least most of the time. The Cloaca Maxima, engineering in stone. The Cloaca Maxima itself was a monument of masonry. Built with massive tufa and later concrete blocks, it was nearly impervious to collapse. Its barrel-vaulted roof allowed for maintenance crews to access it. Some sections were over 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall. It extended nearly 2 miles, sloping gently toward the river. It accepted waste from across the city, not just sewage, but runoff, market refuse, animal waste, and debris from storms. Once emptied into the Tiber, the waste diluted downstream, though this practice naturally contaminated the river and nearby shorelines. Still, for the time, it was astonishingly effective. What about private homes? Most ordinary Romans, especially those in multi-story insulae, apartment buildings, did not have direct sewer connections. Some buildings had cesspits or chamber pots, emptied manually. Others had simple drain pipes leading to the street or a shared latrine. Wealthier homes, domus, sometimes had flushing toilets, using diverted aqueduct water. Street-level residents might use the nearest fountain or latrine, but upper-story dwellers often just emptied their chamber pots out the window. This led to Roman laws against throwing or pouring anything from upper stories. Offenders could be fined or held liable if their waste injured someone below. The result: streets were often messy and sidewalks raised to keep pedestrians above the muck. Maintenance in the shadows. Unlike the grand aqueducts, the sewer system had no arches, no marble inscriptions, no golden statues, but it was vital. City officials, especially the aediles and later curators cloacarum, were charged with inspecting sewers for blockages or collapse, coordinating teams of slaves, freedmen, and contractors to clean and repair the tunnels, responding to flooding events, especially during the winter rains, protecting the network from illegal dumping or sabotage. Maintenance wasn't glamorous. It meant crawling through wet, cramped tunnels, removing sediment, and sometimes encountering dangerous gas pockets. Yet these anonymous laborers kept the city running. The sewers and Roman religion. Interestingly, the Cloaca Maxima was not just functional, it had religious significance. The system was considered the domain of Closina, a minor Roman goddess of sewers and purification. A small shrine, the Sacrum Closina, stood in the forum honoring her. Offerings were sometimes made to ensure smooth drainage or avert floods. Romans believed that the purification of the city through both ritual and sanitation was part of maintaining divine favor. Cleanliness was not just hygienic, it was spiritual. The risks of urban waste. Despite its effectiveness, Rome's sewer system had limits. Heavy rains could overwhelm drains, flooding streets and homes. Sewer gas could build up in enclosed latrines, sometimes exploding when mixed with torchlight. Illegal connections often leaked, damaging buildings or contaminating water sources. Overflow into the Tiber polluted the river, especially downstream where poor communities lived. Still, compared to other ancient cities, Rome was remarkably resilient. Its sewer system allowed dense urban life to persist and expand, where other cities stagnated. What remains today? Many parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still intact. Sections remain active, carrying runoff into the Tiber to this day. Others are accessible via archaeological tour or underground tunnels. Roman engineers, stonework remains surprisingly well preserved, a testament to their skill. Modern engineers studying ancient Rome are often startled by the durability, alignment, and longevity of these underground structures. The Cloaca Maxima, begun in the 6th century BCE, has outlived empires, popes, and parliaments. The Cloaca Maxima and its branching network didn't just move filth, they moved possibility. They drained the marsh to build the forum. They enabled mass urban life without unbearable disease. They supported the baths, the fountains, and even the social rituals of Roman cleanliness. And yet they remained hidden. Beneath the sandals of senators and the carts of bakers, beneath temples and villas, the sewers of Rome flowed silently, bearing the burden of civilization without complaint. In our final section of this story, we'll explore the material that made it all possible: Roman concrete, a dull, gray miracle that reshaped cities, ports, and empires. You followed the water from its mountain spring to its final descent into the sewers of Rome. You've seen how channels, tunnels, fountains, and drains formed the beating heart of the Roman city. But what held it all together? Stone, yes, brick at times, but above all, concrete. In the Roman world, concrete, opus cementitium, was the silent partner of progress. You didn't notice it because it wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to last. And last it did. Over 2,000 years later, Roman concrete structures still stand. Piers in the sea, vaults underground, domes in the skyline. Without concrete, there would be no aqueduct arches, no sewer tunnels, no Pantheon, no Colosseum. Rome's material world, and therefore its cultural and imperial world, was built not only with ideas, but with mud, lime, ash, and time. What is Roman concrete? Roman concrete was a mixture of lime, calcium oxide from heating limestone; water, aggregate stone or crushed brick; pozzolana, volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples region. What made this blend remarkable was the pozzolana. Unlike modern Portland cement, which can be prone to cracking, Roman pozzolanic concrete gained strength over time, even underwater. The key was the chemical reaction between the volcanic ash and lime, in the presence of water, a process called pozzolanic reaction. This created a dense, durable matrix of crystals that bound the material together. The result: a concrete that was self-healing, resistant to salt water, and could last for centuries with little maintenance. Before concrete, the limitations of stone and brick. In earlier centuries, Roman builders relied primarily on cut stone and mud brick, techniques inherited from the Etruscans and Greeks. Cut stone was durable, but required skilled labor and slow construction. Brick was faster but limited in strength and height. Arches, vaults, and domes required precise stonework and were often small in scale. Concrete changed that. It was malleable when wet, could fill molds or forms, and then set hard into strong shapes. It allowed curved walls, wide vaults, tall multi-story structures. massive domes and foundations. Most importantly, it enabled speed and scale, a Roman obsession. From hidden core to architectural statement, early Roman concrete was typically hidden. Builders would pour concrete inside wooden frames, then face the surface with stone, brick, or plaster. These facings varied over time. Opus incertum, irregular stones. Opus reticulatum, diamond-shaped patterns. Opus latericium, brick facing. But beneath the decorative skin was the concrete core, the true structure. Later, some Roman buildings began to embrace the material itself, exposing the concrete vaults or ceilings as architectural features, especially during the imperial period. This blend of form and function, visibility and invisibility, made concrete a material both humble and revolutionary. Concrete underwater, the silent ports of empire. One of the most astonishing uses of Roman concrete was marine construction. Romans used wooden caissons, large molds, to pour concrete directly into the sea. The pozzolana-lime mix reacted with seawater to harden into a rock-like material that resisted erosion. With this technology, they built harbors at Ostia, Caesarea Maritima, and Portus, sea walls, piers, and breakwaters, foundations for lighthouses and docks. Caesarea Maritima, built under Herod with Roman engineers around 20 BCE, featured a massive artificial harbor using underwater concrete, the first of its kind in the world. The durability is astounding. In places, these submerged structures have survived over 2,000 years of ocean currents and remain largely intact. Modern marine engineers still study Roman methods to this day. Engineering megastructures, domes, vaults, and arches. Concrete freed Roman architecture from the constraints of post and lintel design. Builders could now construct spacious interiors without interior columns by using barrel vaults, groin vaults, large domes. Perhaps the most famous example, the Pantheon, completed around 126 CE under Emperor Hadrian, features a 142-foot wide dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. The concrete varies in density: heavier basalt at the base, lighter pumice near the top, a brilliant engineering solution. At its center is the oculus, an open eye to the sky, 30 feet wide, reducing weight and symbolizing divine connection. This wasn't just construction, it was cosmology and architecture, made possible by concrete. Infrastructure and concrete, roads, baths, and basilicas. Concrete wasn't limited to temples and domes. It formed the backbone of daily Roman life. Roadbeds were often layered with concrete, stone, and gravel, creating roads so durable that some are still used today. Bath complexes, like the Baths of Caracalla, used concrete to build vast vaulted halls and heating systems. Basilicas, law courts, and gathering places featured wide open interiors for civic business. Warehouses and insulae used concrete walls to support multiple stories. Even in private homes, concrete enabled fire-resistant walls, underground cisterns, and efficient floor heating, hypocausts. Concrete allowed the Romans to standardize and replicate their architectural footprint across the empire from Britannia to North Africa. Limitations and challenges. Roman concrete was a marvel, but not without drawbacks. It was heavy, limiting span length without support. Setting took a long time, especially in cold climates. Variations in volcanic ash led to inconsistent quality across regions. Later builders sometimes cut corners, leading to crumbling walls. Still, when mixed and applied properly, Roman concrete could outlast stone. In fact, it often did. The concrete foundations of structures like the Colosseum or the Baths of Diocletian are still structurally sound, even if their marble facings have been stripped away. The decline and rediscovery. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, the formula and methods for Roman concrete gradually disappeared. Medieval builders reverted to rubble masonry and simpler mortars. Vaults and domes became rarer, riskier, and smaller. Large-scale construction waned for centuries. It wasn't until the 18th–19th centuries that scientists and architects began to rediscover the composition and potential of Roman concrete. Modern concrete, Portland cement, became dominant but still lacked the longevity of its ancient counterpart. In the 21st century, researchers are now studying Roman marine concrete to improve sustainability. The goal? To create self-healing, durable concrete for modern infrastructure, inspired by ancient ash and lime. Concrete as a philosophy. To the Romans, concrete was more than a material. It was a statement of control over nature to tame earth and water, build cities from scratch, and shape the physical world according to the will of empire. It was also a tool of humility. Unlike marble, concrete was not meant to dazzle. It held up the things that did. Most importantly, it was repeatable. Whether in Tunisia or Turkey, Roman engineers could bring the same aqueduct, bathhouse, or basilica to any city the architecture of empire made possible by the gray slurry beneath it all. Roman concrete was not a monument. It was a medium. It enabled the quiet things, the pipes under the baths, the arch under the road, the wall behind the marble. It was the invisible skeleton of empire, patient, strong, and enduring. Today, as we rebuild our cities and reshape our infrastructure, we look again to the past not for ornament, but for endurance. The dullest material of Roman history may yet shape our future.